Chapter 2032. Just this question alone was enough to put him in a difficult position. Shen Luoan scratched his head in frustration before standing up and asking, "Where did she go?" Mrs. Shen glanced at him and snorted. "He ran out a long time ago. Do you think you can find him now?" Upon hearing this, Shen Luo immediately picked up his cell phone and dialed Shen Manting's number. Soon, Shen Manting's cell phone rang from inside the room. The ringtone was pleasing to the ear, but it made Shen Luo even more agitated. Shen Luo tossed his phone aside and stormed out in a huff. When he opened the door, it was pitch black outside. Only the streetlights were dimly lit. It was already late at night. Shen Manting was still wearing simple and comfortable home clothes. She didn't bring her cell phone, let alone money or identification card. It was already so late, and she had nothing on her. Where could she go? Shen Luo furrowed his brows and rushed out shouting, "Shen Manting!" At this time, she shouldn't have gone far. Shen Luo heard the sound of insects in the yard. He ran out, looked around, and finally ran to the left. But after running back and forth for a long time, he still couldn't find her. Shen Luo felt a little defeated. He stopped and stood by the side of the road panting. His mind spun quickly as he carefully recalled the places she might have been to, or the routes she might have taken when she was in a bad mood. After thinking for a long time, Shen Luo located 3 locations. First, a bar. However, she didn't have any money right now, so it was impossible for her to go to such a place to have fun. The second was to go to a friend's house. She did not have many friends. One of them was her former classmate, and the other was a famous socialite in the capital. It was impossible for her to be a socialite. It was very likely that she would go to her classmate's house. However, she didn't even have a phone on her, so she could only put this possibility aside for now. The last possibility was she was still nearby. She hadn't gone far. Shen Manting was a fake artistic youth. When she was in a bad mood, she would probably play on the swing. Shen Luo was confused by his sudden thought. Inexplicably, he thought of the swing in the park, the place where children often climbed up and down. Not to mention adults, even children wouldn't have enough to play with. For some reason, Shen Luo walked in the direction of the park. Under the dim streetlights, the swing in the park was empty. There was no one there at all. Shen Luo suddenly felt that he was a little funny, but at the same time, he was greatly disappointed. Just as he was about to turn around and leave, he suddenly caught a glimpse of a shadow on the basketball court in the distance. Xiao Xiao shrank under the backboard, her back to the lights, casting a long shadow. Shen Luo was slightly short-sighted, so he didn't see who it was. However, he still subconsciously lightened his footsteps and walked over. Shen Manting leaned against the pillar under the backboard. The cold touch made her feel even more at a loss. Inexplicably, he felt a little sad. Tears streamed down her cheeks uncontrollably, and she felt extremely aggrieved. He buried his face between his legs and whimpered softly. However, he suddenly heard faint footsteps behind him. She looked back and saw that it was Shen Luo. Shen Manting was startled. She immediately got up and bounced back subconsciously. Seeing this, Shen Luo stopped and said, "Let's talk." The conflict in her heart grew deeper and deeper. Chapter 2033. Shen Luo felt a pang in his heart when he saw Shen Manting retreating. Just like before, she seemed to be afraid of him. "If you don't want to sign it, then don't sign it. Let's go back and have a good talk." Shen Luo looked at her and spoke very slowly. It was as if he was careful with every word he said. Shen Manting stared at him from afar and didn't say anything. Shen Luo felt even more hurt. He looked at her from afar and said softly, "I know that sometimes my mouth is a little bad, but actually, you're still very good looking." Shen Luo felt a little ashamed to say this. A feeling he had never felt before surrounded him. He quietly took a step closer and said, "It's true. Both your face and your figure are better than before. The reason why I said that was because I didn't want you to be compared to those people." Shen Manting was moved by his words, but the tears in her eyes couldn't help but flow down. How could she not know? This guy had always been like this, but she couldn't stand it anymore. It was not only because of his unparalleled bad mouth, but also because of the indelible things he had done to her. "Manting, go back first. Mom is taking care of the baby now. Mom has to go back to the hospital tomorrow. Think about it. If she's not in a good mood during the operation, how guilty would it be? Shin Luoan slowly approached her. Shin Luoan. Shin Manting looked at him with a pair of clear eyes with a pair of desolate light. Do you know that I've always hated you? Shin Luoan was stunned and didn't say anything. I used to think that you were a big brother that I could rely on. A big tree that could shelter me from the wind and rain. Shin Manting said in a choked voice. But I never thought that I would have a relationship with you. I thought that I would be able to endure it. But who knew that you would become even worse? Shin Luoan was slightly shocked and looked at her in disbelief. When you said that you would marry me to Oming, I was so happy. I thought, I can finally leave you. I don't have to be this incestuous person anymore. God knows how scared I was when I faced my parents and grandma every day, when they treated me like a daughter or a granddaughter. I'm afraid that they'll call me a slut. They brought me back and treated me like their daughter and descendant. But I've become a slut who seduced the man they're so proud of. Do you know how it feels? I live in guilt every day. At that time, Yi was still at home. I called her sister-in-law over and over again. But did she know that her husband was in my bed every night? Shin Manting was on the verge of a breakdown. She clutched her chest and said, I've had enough. I've finally escaped. I thought that by giving birth to the baby, I could threaten you and force you to give me a sum of money so that I could run away. As she spoke, she swallowed a mouthful of saliva and stared at him fixedly. But I can't do it. I can't bear to part with the baby. I can't bear to use him as a bargaining chip for my freedom. But I'm not willing to be imprisoned by you and raped by you. Raping her. Such a blatant word was exposed right in front of his eyes. For a moment, Shin Luoan couldn't accept it. Shin Manting's voice trembled as she sobbed. Her thin body was like a piece of cardboard, and she was on the verge of collapsing. Chapter 2034. In your eyes, I'm nothing more than a sex slave. Shin Manting looked at him with tears streaming down her face. You've always loved Yu, but you hated Yu for so many years because of Guan Kui. I feel so sad for you. Shin Luoan clenched his fists and glared at Shin Manting. He gritted his teeth and said, Shin Manting. Shin Manting chuckled and reached out to wipe her tears. Why? You want to hit me? Shin Luoan walked quickly towards her. Her expression changed, and she immediately said, Shin Luoan, what do you want? However, Shin Luoan remained silent. Shin Manting's heart was filled with panic. What did he want to do? Her body reacted faster than her anger. She turned around and ran. The park was huge, and Shin Manting stumbled as she walked. Stop. He didn't expect her to have such a big reaction. I won't hit you. Stop. But Shin Manting wouldn't stop. Her footsteps quickened, and her body leaned forward slightly as she ran. Shin Luoan was very distressed. Shin Manting ran very fast. His figure was light and agile, and he disappeared into the bushes in a few steps. Shin Luoan felt a headache coming on and shouted, Wait a minute. I'll agree to anything you say. Manting, I never thought that you would have such thoughts. Wait a minute. Shin Manting could clearly hear the voice behind her, and her heart trembled slightly. But his footsteps did not stop. Soon he was out of the road. After running for some time, she suddenly heard Shin Luoan's voice shouting, Get out of the way! Pa, the sound of a long car horn. Shin Manting paused and turned to look at him. The glaring light immediately burned her eyes to the point of pain. He subconsciously narrowed his eyes. When the sports car crashed into her, Shin Manting had a thought in her mind. It's time to put an end to this. Shin Luoan clearly saw the car crash. His pupil shrank and he shouted, Shin Manting! A voice that was on the verge of collapse came from not far away. Shin Manting heard a crisp sound coming from her body. In an instant, a tearing pain spread throughout her entire body. So painful was he finally going to die. Mrs. Shin finally managed to coax the baby to sleep. Just as she walked out of the door, she suddenly heard the baby crying loudly. This kind of crying came too suddenly, and Shin Furan was caught off guard and jumped in fright. She hurriedly went forward and picked up the baby. Her heart ached for him as she gently coaxed him. However, the baby's cry this time was different. His little face was flushed red, and his little fists were waving in the air. No matter how she coaxed, hugged, or fed him, he couldn't stop. Mrs. Shun was so anxious that she was about to cry. This was the first time she had sat on the sofa with a baby in her arms, feeling lost. Why aren't they back yet? Mrs. Shun stomped her feet in anger. She picked up her phone and dialed Shin Luo An's number. It rang for a long time, but no one picked up. Finally, when it was about to automatically hang up, someone picked up. Hello? Luoan. Mom. Shin Luoan's voice trembled, and it was obvious that he was choking. Mrs. Shin tensed up. What's wrong? However, before Shin Luoan could say anything, he heard a trembling wail. Mrs. Shin was frightened and immediately panicked. She shouted, What's wrong? What's wrong? Chapter 2035. What's wrong? Mrs. Shun had a bad feeling about this. She had watched Shin Luoan grow up, but she had never seen him like this. You have to tell me what's wrong, Mrs. Shun said sternly. Otherwise, I'll track your cell phone signal to find you. It's nothing. Don't ask. Rest early. Shin Luoan hung up the phone. The more Mrs. Shun thought about it, the more she felt that something was wrong. But the baby cried harder and harder, and Mrs. Shun was confused. She quickly picked him up and comforted him slowly. But the feeling of being kept in the dark was very uncomfortable. Shin Manting was seriously injured. Her left arm was fractured in 3 places, and her right leg was severely abraded. Her cheeks were also blood-stained, and the deep and shallow marks were shocking. The most serious injury was on her head. Her head was severely injured, and there was bleeding in many places. Her life was in danger. Shin Luoan almost couldn't stand when he heard the diagnosis. His hands trembled as he looked at the surgical consent letter. After signing it, he couldn't help but sit on the chair in front of the emergency room. He grabbed his hair with his blood-stained hands and cried in despair and grief. I'm sorry. A man in his 30s or 40s stood beside him and sobbed regretfully. I'm sorry, Luoan. I drank a little, and I thought there would be no one around. Shin Luoan had already lost his strength, but at this moment, he suddenly stood up when he heard this. He stared at him with bloodshot eyes and punched him hard in the face. Zhou Xinghui was in pain and took a step back. Luoan. Shin Luoan strode forward and kicked him hard on the body. Zhou Xinghui was kicked to the ground. Before he could react, Shin Luoan had already straddled him, and his fists were like hail, falling heavily. Why did you drink? Why did you drive? Why didn't you look at the road? Zhou Xinghui didn't fight back, nor did he resist. After a while, his face was covered in blood. There were many people in the corridor of the emergency room, and the passing nurses exclaimed, That's enough. Someone pull them away. Why, Zhou Xinghui? What do I owe you? You hurt my woman like this. It was as if Shin Luoan had completely lost his mind. He attacked mercilessly. When he was pulled away, Zhou Xinghui had already fainted. The blood on his face was mixed with tears, and his face was filled with guilt. Shin Longyue was suddenly informed by the hospital staff that Shin Manting was in trouble. He rushed to the hospital in a hurry. However, she did not expect to receive news that Shin Luoan had seriously injured someone and rendered them unconscious. She rushed to the emergency room and saw Shin Luoan sitting at the door from afar. His face was expressionless as he sat at the door, as if he had lost his soul. His home clothes were stained with blood, and he was wearing slippers. Shin Longyue's heart sank. Luoan. Shin Luoan tilted his head slightly. His gray eyes were deathly still. When he saw his father, his eyes trembled and he called out, Dad. What's wrong with Manting? When Shin Luoan was asked this question, he suddenly felt as if his sore spot had been poked. He couldn't help but feel guilty and remorseful, and his eyes reddened. Shin Luoan had always been calm. Ever since he became sensible, she had never seen him like this. Chapter 2036. Shin Longyue's heart sank when the nurse told him about Shin Manting's condition. The nurse saw his gloomy expression and asked curiously, Director, is the person inside your room? Shin Longyue glanced at her and sighed softly. My daughter-in-law. The nurse's eyes were full of sympathy and distress when she heard this. She saw the man with tears and tears on his face at the door. There was no doubt that he was the son of the director. She comforted him and left quickly. Shin Longyue sat down beside Shin Luoan and then silently sat with him. The father and son sat at the door for 10 hours. Shen Longyue and Shen Luo, and kept their eyes open and staring at the door of the operating room. They didn't even yawn or take a nap. Finally, the door of the operating room opened. The chief surgeon opened the door and was stunned when he saw Shen Longyue. Director? Shen Luo, and immediately got up and grabbed the chief surgeon's clothes. How is the person inside? Shen Longyue also came over and said, This is my son, and the woman inside is my daughter-in-law. How is she now? The chief surgeon was silent for a moment and seemed to be thinking. Then he said, She's not in good condition. Although she has received a blood transfusion, her injuries are too serious. Her limbs are broken, and she has lost blood in many parts of her brain. The patient has been in a coma for a long time. It's hard to say whether she will wake up or not. Shen Luoan's face instantly turned pale. He clutched his surgical gown tightly and shouted angrily, What do you mean? Luoan. Shen Longyue pulled him back. Listen to him first. Little Qin, has she passed the critical period? Dr. Qin shook his head and said, Not for the time being. I've given her medicine, and there may be complications within 24 hours. She has to stay in the ICU for observation. If she can survive these 24 hours, she may survive. Shen Luo, and was even more furious when he heard this. He roared, What do you mean by she may survive? Dr. Qin looked at him and sighed softly. Her injuries are too serious. If her vital signs can be stabilized, then she may not die. These vague and heartless words were so cruel that Shen Luoan trembled. She glared at him with bloodshot eyes and said, If she stabilizes, can she wake up? Dr. Qin was silent for a moment and looked at Shen Longyue. Director, you know. Shen Longyue's eyes were already red. He supported Shen Luo and then said in a choked voice, Luoan, go and rest first. Tell me. Shen Luoan could no longer stand. He was half collapsed and half standing. His voice was almost pleading. Stubble had appeared on his originally clean and refined face. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with blood and tears, making him look particularly miserable and ferocious. Dr. Qin couldn't bear it, but he looked at Shen Longyue and said, Even if he survives, there's a high possibility that he'll become a vegetable. Shen Luoan felt as though he had been struck by lightning. His body stiffened and his mind went blank. There was a high possibility that he would end up in a vegetative state. Shen Luoan collapsed in despair and cried out, It's impossible. It's impossible. Shen Longyue was heartbroken and desperate. He pulled Shen Luoan and cried in a low voice, Shen Luoan, stand up. Chapter 2037. Shen Longyue felt a dull pain in his heart. He had high hopes for his son since he was a child. Shen Luoan was also very promising. No matter what he did it well. Shen Luoan never understood what he was thinking about when it came to love. When Guan Kui committed suicide because of him, he didn't shed a single tear. Now, Shen Manting was in trouble, and he was in this state. Shen Longyue suddenly hated Shen Manting. He hated her for not living up to his expectations. He hated her for getting hurt so badly. Looking at his son, Shen Longyue closed his eyes. Go back first. Your son is still waiting for you to come home. Shen Luoan heard that and whispered, Yes, my son is still waiting for me. She took Shen Longyue's hand and was about to get up. However, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head. All of a sudden, his feet slipped, and his whole body fell straight down. Shen Longyue was shocked. Luoan? When he checked again, Shen Luoan had already fainted. Shen Luoan was unconscious for a day and a night. The Shen family was in a mess. Shen Jilie and Yi Qianqian had just finished their wedding in Yun Town when they heard the bad news. When the couple hurried back to their home in the capital, they heard the cries of the baby. Mrs. Shen looked haggard. When she saw her son and daughter-in-law return, she couldn't help but cry. You're finally back. Yi Qianqian's tears fell. She rushed forward and called out, Mom. Shen Jilie saw her and didn't say a word. He reached out and took the baby. The baby had obviously cried for a long time. His voice was hoarse, and his face was pink. Coming. Nanny, he quickly came out with a bottle in her hand. When she saw Shen Jilie, she handed it to him. Feed the baby first. Mrs. Shen sat on the sofa and wailed. She hugged Yi Qianqian and couldn't stop. Yi Qianqian's heart felt like it was being corroded by thousands of ants. She gently patted her back and whispered, "Don't cry. Don't cry, Mom." Although that was what she said, she cried even harder. Shinjulia didn't say a word. He carried the baby back to his room. His heart was heavy. He called Shen Longyue, and the call was quickly picked up. However, his voice sounded very tired. "Julia." "Dad." Shin Julia's expression was solemn. "Is brother awake?" "Not yet." "Where's Sister Manting?" Shen Longyue did not reply. He sighed and said, "Take good care of your mother and the baby. I'll inform you when Manting wakes up. I'll leave the baby with Qianqian. I'll go to the hospital later." "All right." Shen Longyue was exhausted. Not only was he physically tired, but he was also mentally tired. He had never been so tired before. After feeding the baby and coaxing him to sleep, Shen Julia went to Shen Luo'an's room. After settling him down, he gave Yi Qianqian some instructions before driving to the hospital. When she stepped into the ward, Shen Luo'an happened to wake up. The first thing he asked when he woke up was, "How's Manting?" "Brother, father," Shen Julia said as he walked in. "Sister Manting is fine. She has passed the critical stage and is still under observation." When Shen Luo'an heard this, he immediately lifted the blanket and got out of bed. "I'll go take a look." As soon as he got off the bed, he staggered. Shen Julia quickly held him up and said, "Be careful." Shen Luo'an's vision was a little blurry. It took him a while to stand up straight. Chapter 2038. Shen Luo'an's physical fitness wasn't particularly strong. He had endured for a long time yesterday and the day before, so he couldn't take it anymore. Shen Julia held him and sighed softly. "Brother, you have to take care of yourself, so that you can take care of Manting." Shen Luo'an opened his eyes and composed himself. "I'll go and take a look." Shen Manting was in the ICU while Shen Luo'an looked in through the glass. His heart ached when he saw her hands and feet tied up. Her head was completely wrapped with only a white bandage that was slightly bleeding. She looked particularly pathetic. His heart felt as if it had been fiercely stabbed, and the pain was almost suffocating. When he came back to his senses, he found that tears had rolled down his face. Shen Luo'an's body twitched, and he couldn't bear it anymore. He squatted down and cried bitterly. Shen Julia had lived to his late 20s, and had grown up with Shen Luo'an. He had never seen him like this before. He squatted down silently and stood side by side with him. Shen Julia gently patted his shoulder and didn't make a sound. Shen Manting slept for half a month. The doctor finally confirmed that she had become a vegetable. The atmosphere in the Shen family was oppressive. 2 years wasn't long, but it wasn't short either. Since Shen Manting was lying in the hospital, Shen Luo'an had devoted himself to the studio. He spent the rest of his time in the studio, except for the 2 hours he spent by Shen Manting's bed with the child. "Daddy." The child stumbled into Shen Luo'an's arms, holding a cute fluffy toy in his hands. "Daddy, this is a gift from Grandma." Shen Luo'an stood up with his son in his arms and said, "Little bunny, you're so cute." Little Moon grinned and said, "Daddy, come see Mommy." Shen Luo'an's eyes softened and he said, "Okay, Daddy will take you to see Mommy." Little Moon was very obedient. He had just celebrated his 2nd birthday and was very intelligent. His facial features looked more and more like Shen Luo'an, as if they were carved from the same mold. Shen Luo'an drove him to the hospital. It was very quiet. It was a particularly warm winter. The hospital was a little quieter than usual after the new year. He led the little boy to Shen Manting's ward with ease. He lowered his head and said, "What did Daddy teach you? What do you have to do first when you enter the ward?" "Knock on the door." Little Moon held the bunny in his arms, clenched his fists, and knocked on the door twice. He even said, "Knock, knock." Shen Luo'an smirked. Then, he pushed the door open and shouted along with Little Moon, "Mom, Little Moon is here to see you." The father and son walked in, but when Shen Luo'an saw the hospital bed, he suddenly felt as if all the blood in his body had flowed backward to his brain. Suddenly, his mind went blank. The sickbed was empty. Suddenly Shen Luo'an roared, "Where is he?" Xiao Yuer was startled by her loud voice. Little Moon's mouth twitched, and he took a step back and burst into tears. Shen Luo'an and also realized that he was overreacting. He quickly picked up the child and went outside. He roared, "Where is she? Who is looking after this ward? Where is Shin Manting?" His voice was extremely loud. His voice echoed in the corridor. Soon, a nurse ran over and poked her head in to take a look. There was no one in the ward. Her heart skipped a beat and she asked, "Where is he?" Chapter 2039. The nurse shuddered and immediately said, "I'll go look for her right away." After saying that, she ran away as if she was escaping. Little Moon had stopped crying. He hugged Shin Luo'an's neck and asked, "Daddy, where's Mommy?" Shin Luo'an couldn't help panicking. His heart was beating extremely fast, and an unbearable despair was currently pressing down on his chest, causing him to almost be unable to breathe. "Daddy, don't cry." Little Moon's soft little palm brushed across Shin Luo'an's eyes. Shin Luo'an took a deep breath and coaxed him softly. "Little Moon's a good boy. Daddy will take you to Grandpa first." It wasn't far from the hospital director's office. Shin Longyue was shocked to see Shin Luo'an's reddened eyes. "What's wrong?" Shin Luo'an tried to calm himself down and said, "Daddy, look after the child. Manting is missing." Shin Longyue was shocked. "What? Why would she disappear out of nowhere?" Shin Luo'an also had the same question welling up in his heart. However, no one could answer him. "Now we can only check the surveillance footage to see when Manting left. Daddy, I'll leave this matter to you. I'll go look for her. Even the nurse didn't find her, so she can't have gone far." Shin Longyue knew the gravity of the matter and nodded. "Okay." After receiving his confirmation, Shin Luo'an immediately put the child down and ran away. Little Moon was puzzled. He tilted his head and asked, "Grandpa, where did Daddy go?" Shin Longyue picked up the child and said, "Daddy went to look for Mommy." Then he made a phone call and went to the surveillance room. Shin Luo'an ran hurriedly to the ward and corridor next to him. At the same time, there were many doctors and nurses looking for him. A vegetable had disappeared without anyone noticing. This matter was simply absurd to the extreme. Many people hurried around to look for him. Soon, everyone knew what had happened. After checking the surveillance footage, there was no one like Shin Manting who had left. Shin Luo'an went from the first floor to the 7th floor, but found nothing. Shin Luo'an leaned against the wall helplessly. He felt a cold touch on his back. Suddenly someone shouted, "Found her!" Shin Luo'an immediately became alert and ran in the direction of the voice. "Who? Found who?" "The vegetative patient in room 139 has been found." Shin Luo'an immediately rushed forward and saw a group of people blocking the door of a ward from afar. "Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me." Shin Luo'an pushed his way through the crowd. As soon as he entered, he heard a child crying. The child opened his mouth and cried, holding half a bun in his hand. After glancing at Shin Luo'an, he turned to look at the corner. In the corner, there was a woman with disheveled hair. His face was pale, and his body was thin and weak. She was dressed in a loose hospital gown, and was hugging her legs nervously. She raised her eyes and looked at Shin Luo'an. That look, that gaze. Clean and pure, like an innocent child. However, Shin Luo'an recognized Shin Manting at a glance. After lying in bed for 2 years, Shin Manting was as thin as a stick. But that charm, even if she were dead, he would still recognize it. Unknowingly, droplets of water were already dripping from his eyes. Shin Luo'an walked over and called out softly, "Manting." Chapter 2040. His voice was trembling with obvious fear. Shin Luo'an was stunned. He suddenly squatted down and reached out to hold her arm. "What did you say?" "Ah." Shin Manting's body trembled violently, and tears streamed down her face. She trembled in fear and shouted, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Uncle, let me go. I won't do it again." His voice was filled with regret and unspeakable fear. Shin Luo'an felt as if his heart had been bitten by thousands of ants. He stared at her in disbelief, his heart aching. Shin Manting begged, and was about to kneel down. "Enough!" Shin Luo'an bellowed angrily. Then, he pulled her into his arms and held her firmly in his arms. Shin Manting was stunned, and her body trembled uncontrollably. "Enough, enough!" Shin Luo'an's voice was choked with sobs filled with endless despair. He buried his face in her neck and said in a trembling voice, "It's really enough." Manting, I'm sorry. Shin Manting was stunned and didn't know what to do for a moment. She could clearly feel the warmth of the man in front of her, and the fear and nervousness in her heart immediately dissipated. For some reason, he felt a slight pain in his heart. However, he was still rational. She gently pushed him and shouted, "Uncle!" Shin Luo and let go of her and looked at the blank expression on her face. He got up and said, "Get up. I'll take you home." Go home." A look of fear flashed across Shin Manting's face. She pushed him away and shouted, "Uncle, don't call me uncle." Shin Luo's voice was a bit loud, but when he turned around, he saw that Shin Manting was obviously frightened. His heart ached, and his voice softened. "Follow me back to the ward first. Let the doctor examine you." Shin Manting looked around. All the medical equipment was clearly displayed, and many people were wearing hospital gowns. There was also the smell of medicine and disinfectant in the air. Shin Manting suddenly panicked and burst into tears again. "Am I sick again? Is Uncle Dean angry?" Shin Luo held her hand and slowly stood up. But when she heard this, she couldn't help but burst into tears. He covered his face with one hand and remained silent. Soon, he pushed his way through the crowd and walked out. Shin Manting remained quiet throughout, sobbing as she followed behind Shin Luo. "Don't cry." Then he pulled her into his arms with one hand and said, "Be quiet for the examination first. Answer whatever the doctor asks you later. Do you understand?" Shin Manting nodded blankly. She sniffled hard and said, "Got it." Shin Luo picked up his phone and called Shin Julia. "Found it." As soon as he hung up the phone, he heard an old man's voice. Shin Manting looked over and saw a gentle and kind-looking man walking over. He was carrying a child who looked to be in his 50s or 60s. When Shen Longhua saw Shin Manting, he was shocked. Then he swallowed hard and said, Good, you're finally awake." It was Shin Yuexiao's first time seeing Shin Manting with her eyes open. He was a little curious, so he struggled to get off the bed and asked, "Mom?" Shin Manting heard his voice and looked around. Then, she looked at Shin Luo in astonishment and said, "You are a woman? But. Chapter 2041. As soon as she finished speaking, the three people in the room all looked at her. A look of sorrow, a look of curiosity, a look of doubt. Shen Longhua frowned when he heard this. "Luo, what's going on?" Shen Luo looked at his father and shook his head blankly. "She doesn't seem to recognize me." Soon a doctor rushed over. When he saw Shen Longhua, he was stunned and called out, "Director." "Director?" Shen Longhua nodded and said, "Give her a checkup." "Yes." The medical staff quickly arrived. "Please take them out." Following his instructions, they quickly left the room. After a series of examinations, the doctors came out. However, when they came out, the doctors had a strange look on their faces. "She seems to have forgotten who she is. What's going on?" Shin Julia hurried down. He was still wearing a white coat and was panting slightly. "Is Sister Manting awake?" "Yes." Shin Luo closed his eyes. "That's great. It's good that she's awake. Everything else can be solved." Shin Julia breathed a sigh of relief. Her brain was severely damaged. It's normal for her to have memory problems. "I'll go in and take a look." The doctor also recognized Shin Julia, so he nodded and didn't stop him. When Shin Julia went in, he saw Shin Manting trying to sneak through the window. She had already lifted one foot, but she seemed to have no strength. It was very difficult. Shin Julia was shocked and shouted, "What are you doing?" Shin Manting trembled violently and turned her head to look. When she saw Shin Julia running over, she immediately hugged the window railing and shouted, "Ah, no, don't pull me. I don't have money to pay for the medical fees. Just let me jump off the building and die." Shin Julia was stunned. Without another word, he pulled her down from the chair. Shin Manting's body was as light as a swallow. He could directly pull her up with one hand. Shin Manting's face was sad, and she struggled with her hands and feet. When she found that she couldn't move, she actually hugged Shin Julia's thigh. Shin Julia was shocked. Before he could react, he heard a loud roar coming from below. "Sob, sob, sob, Uncle, I don't have money. Don't check me anymore. I'm an orphan. I don't have money." The orphanage is going to collapse. If Uncle Director knows that I've been checked so many times in the hospital, he'll definitely kill me. Please don't check me anymore. Julia didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he heard that. When she turned around, Shen Luoan and Shen Longyue had already walked in. Shen Luoan's face darkened when he saw what she was doing. He quickly stepped forward and pulled her away. But Shen Manting seemed to be possessed. She clung to Shen Julia's thigh tightly and cried out, "Uncle, don't pull me. I don't have money to pay for the medical fees even if you pull me. I'll pay you back when I grow up. Don't go looking for Uncle Director. He'll kill me." When Shen Luoan heard this, his arms trembled even more. He gritted his teeth and shouted, "Shen Manting, stand up, or else I'll make you pay the medical fees yourself." Shen Manting suddenly stopped crying and looked at Shen Luoan. She sobbed and said, "Are you talking to me? Is there anyone else called Shen Manting here besides you?" Shen Manting immediately stood up, but her body was weak, and she almost fell down again. Shen Luoan reacted quickly and held her in his arms. Shen Manting was 168 centimeters, and Shen Luo was 180 centimeters. When she stood up, her forehead was just close to his chin. Chapter 2042. As soon as she said that, Shen Julia burst into laughter. Shen Luoan's face darkened. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifted her up, and put her on the hospital bed. He looked at Shen Manting for a while and couldn't help but say, "Because I'm your man." "Ah." Shen Manting looked at him with her eyes wide open. "What?" Shen Julia quickly pulled Shen Luoan and said, "Brother, don't scare her. Leave it to me. You can go out first." "No." Shen Luoan took a stool and sat down. "You do what you need to do. I'll sit here." "How can we do that?" Shen Julia frowned, but when he saw the unhappy look on his father's face, he couldn't help but cough softly and curl his lips. "In that case, Dad, please take care of little Moon for a while." Shen Longyue knew the gravity of the situation. He nodded and said, "Little Moon, let's go." Shen Yueshao didn't comply. He looked at Shen Manting with his big black eyes and said, "Mom." Shen Manting finally saw it clearly. She was shocked and exclaimed, "No way. Is she calling me mommy? When did I have such a big son?" Shen Longyue's heart ached when he heard this. He glanced at Shen Manting and sighed. "Let's go, little Moon. Come back to see Mom later." "Okay." Shen Yueshao was reluctant to leave. "Mom, little Moon will come back to see you tomorrow." Shen Manting heard a childish voice. Shen Manting listened to it and found it familiar. She seemed to hear this sentence every day. She felt a dull pain in her heart. Suddenly, she felt as if she had seen a ghost. She looked at the two men in front of her and sat quietly. Shen Luo picked up his recording pen and turned it on. He said, "From now on, I'll ask you a question and you'll answer it. Tell me everything you know and the truth. Do you understand?" "Okay." Shen Manting looked at Shen Luo and then at Shen Julia. She said, "Uncle, will your brother really pay for my medical expenses?" When Shen Julia heard this, he chuckled. "How did you know he was my brother? You called him brother just now, and you called the grandfather just now Dad. Also, you look a little similar, which means that you are biological brothers, the sons of the grandfather just now." She then rubbed her stomach and said, "I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry that I don't have any strength left in me." Shen Julia felt relieved. At the very least, his IQ wasn't low. Shen Julia took a few notes in his notebook and said, "I'll get you something to eat later. Answer the question first." "Oh, how old are you?" 12 years old. "A 12-year-old calls me uncle. Do I look that old?" Shen Luoan asked suddenly. Shen Julia almost burst out laughing. It seemed that Shen Luo was very bothered by the way she addressed him as uncle. However, he immediately coughed lightly and said, "Brother, please keep quiet." Shen Luo immediately fell silent. Shen Manting said, "You look like you're in your 30s. Although you're not particularly old, you're much older than me." Yes, this was the 12-year-old Shen Manting. Shen Julia made a few notes in the notebook and asked, "Do you remember what you were doing before you passed out?" "Of course I remember." Shen Manting looked a little sad and said without hesitation, "The director asked me to help him buy soy sauce and go back to cook. But when I went back, I tripped and the soy sauce bottle broke. I was beaten by the director's aunt. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. Shinjilia frowned and looked up. He asked, "Do you remember what your name is?" Hyunsuan. How do you write it? Chapter 2043. Shinjilia and Shin Luoan both looked at her. Shin Manting shrank back under their stares and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong? Have you always been called this name?" Shinjilia asked. As he spoke, he looked at Shin Manting's expression and added, "Tell me the truth." Shin Manting frowned when she heard this and said, "This is my name, not Shin Manting. When I was young, I was abandoned on the street. They didn't even give me a birthday card. Later, an old man who picked up garbage sent me to an orphanage." Shin Luoan was silent. Shinjilia nodded and asked, "And then?" "Then the old man said that since he didn't raise me, why did he give birth to me? So the director gave me this name, Hyunsuan. She gave a child such a name. Why did she allow it to exist?" Shin Luoan felt a little pain in his heart. He realized that he knew nothing about her. "Do you know Zhang Meifang?" Shinjilia recorded in his notebook and looked up at Shin Manting. "Yes," Shin Manting nodded. "She's my good friend. But the director likes her very much. She's beautiful and sensible." Shinjilia and Shin Luoan looked at each other. They both saw a trace of doubt in each other's eyes. "What's wrong?" Shin Manting looked at them and suddenly looked a little sad. She asked in a low voice, "Did you find the wrong person? Is the person you're looking for actually Meifang?" "No, we're looking for you." Shinjilia tapped the back of his hand with the pen and said slowly, "Have you seen me?" "No." "Have you seen him?" "No." "What do you usually like to eat?" Shin Manting exclaimed. When she heard this, she covered her growling stomach and said, "I'm actually not picky. I eat anything." Shin Luoan suddenly asked, "Do you eat onions?" "Ah." Shin Manting's face immediately fell. "No." "Do you eat coriander?" "No." Shin Luoan smiled lightly. "Then why did you say you eat anything?" Shin Manting was speechless. He asked a few more questions. Shin Manting did not hesitate and readily followed his advice. But when she asked about Shin Manting, there was an obvious look of doubt on her face. "Who is Shen Yuexiao? Who is Shen Luoan? Who is Shinjilia? I don't know anyone." "All right," Shinjilia said as he put the notebook away. "I have a general understanding of the situation. Now I have something to tell you. Don't be too shocked." "What?" Shin Manting looked at him curiously with an innocent look on her face. She was completely different from the usual Shin Manting. Shinjilia paused for a moment, then stood up and said, "Give me a moment." After walking out for a few minutes, he came back with a mirror in his hand. He handed it to Shin Manting and said, "Take a look at yourself." When Shin Manting saw this, she was baffled. He took it and looked at it. He turned pale with fright. "Ah." Shin Manting flung the mirror away and asked in horror, "Who is this?" This kind of reaction was a little too big. Shin Luoan didn't expect this and couldn't sit still. He picked up the mirror and said, "This is Shin Manting. She's my sister-in-law and the mother of my nephew. She's 31 years old and lives in the capital. She's been an orphan since she was young." Chapter 2044. However, as soon as Shin Manting finished speaking, she found that the eyes of the two men in front of her remained unchanged. Shin Manting was shocked and suddenly felt a little like crying. She pursed her lips and burst into tears. "You're lying to me. I haven't aged. This isn't me at all. I'm only 12 years old." Shinjilia glanced at Shin Luoan and sighed softly. "Brother, we can't go on like this." Shin Luoan also had a headache and said, "You go ahead. Leave it to me. I'm afraid that you can't handle it." She seems to have lost her memory from the age of 12 to 29. It's a whole 17 years. Shin Manting had a bad feeling and looked at them. "Didn't you say that I was 31 years old?" "Yes." Shinjilia looked at her with a little sympathy in his eyes. "You had a car accident when you were 29. Your hands and feet were broken, and your head was severely injured. You've been lying in bed for 2 years. What? Shin Manting couldn't believe it. "You mean I've been in the hospital for 2 years? How much money is that?" Shinjilia was speechless. She turned around and patted Shin Luoan on the shoulder. Communicate well and guide her. I'll go ahead. Okay. Shin Luoan responded. His eyes calmly fell on Shin Manting. He slowly said, You're the mother of my child. It's my duty to take care of you. What? Shin Manting felt dizzy. I haven't grown up and I'm not married. How could I have a child? Unfortunately you did. Shin Luoan walked over and poured her a glass of water. What do you want for dinner? Shin Manting immediately straightened up. So you're my husband. I want to have a big meal. Is that okay? Husband Shin Luoan was caught off guard. The word suddenly rippled in his heart. He looked at her with his amber eyes and said slowly, Yes. Shin Manting suddenly became excited and said, Then husband, I want to have a big meal. The kind that needs to be cut with a knife and fork. Her eyes were dark and bright, pure and clean, with expectation and desire. Shin Luoan's heart ached. He handed the water to her and said, Drink some water first. Oh. Shin Manting took the water from him and gulped it down. Are we going to have a feast? She asked. Not yet. Shin Manting was disappointed. What? It's all a lie. You made me call you hubby. Give it back to me. He explained. You've just woken up, so your body can't handle it yet. When you're better, I'll take you to whatever you want to eat. Really? Shin Manting looked at him expectantly. You promised. Yes, I will. Shin Luoan nodded. I'll ask my family to prepare a nutritious meal for you. Sure. Shin Manting's eyes sparkled. He was secretly delighted. It seemed like it was pretty good. This uncle looked quite handsome, nice, and had a good personality. The most important thing was that she didn't have to be scolded by Uncle Dean, and she didn't have to deal with the people in the orphanage. She rolled her eyes and looked at Shin Luoan. Then hubby, can I ask you a question? Hubby. It was another word that caught him off guard. Shin Luoan straightened up and answered in a low voice. Yes. We've already given birth to a child. Have we kissed? Shin Luoan looked at her again. Perhaps because such a question was too childish. Chapter 2045. Shin Luoan glanced at her a few more times, because her question was too childish. Shin Manting shrank back and whispered, I swore that my first kiss would be reserved for my Prince Charming. Her silly and cute words made the soft part of Shin Luoan restless for a moment. He moved an inch and leaned toward her. Shin Manting subconsciously shrank back, but in the next moment, Shin Luoan had already reached out and clamped her chin, accurately capturing her lips. The soft and smooth touch was immediately transmitted from his lips. Shin Manting's eyes widened, but soon she closed them again. Shin Luoan had never felt like this before. It turned out that Shin Manting would be so obedient when he kissed her. He couldn't help but ask for more. He gently pried open her lips and teeth, captured her softness and slowly invaded. After an unknown period of time, Shin Manting couldn't stand it anymore. She gently pushed him away, and Shin Luoan released her. Shin Manting immediately panted, and her cheeks were a little red. She looked at him shyly. Shin Luoan was even more confused. He couldn't help but move closer and look at her deeply. Shin Manting shrank back, then lay on the bed, and covered her head with the quilt. Her voice came from under the quilt, and it was a little muffled. Honey, I don't want to have children anymore. After she had a big meal, she would consider whether to continue kissing her biological child. However, she was so hungry now. Kissing shouldn't make her pregnant, right? Shin Manting was a little uncertain. She lifted the quilt and revealed one eye. At a glance, she saw Shin Luoan standing. Shin Luoan looked at her with a deep gaze. He was a little sad and glad. Shin Manting suddenly felt that he was very pitiful. She whispered, Honey, are you very sad? When Shin Luoan heard this, he suddenly smiled and said, No. Then why do you look so sad? Shin Manting looked at him with a little guilt and apology. She whispered, But I still want to say, don't kiss me in the future. What if I get pregnant? I don't want to have children. I heard that giving birth is very painful. Very painful. It can even kill people. Shin Manting thought of this and shrank back. When Shin Luoan heard this, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Who told you that kissing will make you pregnant? Ah. Shin Manting's face was burning with embarrassment. She covered her face with the blanket in embarrassment and whispered, That's what everyone says. Shin Luo, and let out a rare laugh. He moved closer and whispered, I won't, but I'm your Prince Charming. Our child is already 2 years old. You have to call me hubby from now on. Do you understand? Perhaps it was because Shin Luo was so close to her that she felt her heart warm up. Her face was also hot. She nodded and said, Yes, I know, hubby. Shin Luo's heart softened, and tears welled up in his eyes. He turned around and said, I'll make the call. Shin Manting looked at his back and suddenly felt a little sad. This feeling came out of nowhere. It was a little scary, but at the same time, there was satisfaction and excitement. This feeling seemed to be instinctive. Even she herself did not know what she was sad about, excited about, or satisfied about. He stayed in the hospital for 3 days. After 3 days, when the doctors confirmed that she was physically and mentally fit to be discharged, Shin Manting returned to the so-called home. It was a beautiful and luxurious house. She had never seen such a big and beautiful house. Mom. Chapter 2046. Shin Manting was a little frightened. It wasn't that she hadn't seen this child in the past few days, but it was still very difficult for her to accept that such a large meatball had actually popped out from her stomach. She looked at him and squatted down. Shin Yueshao also looked at her. The mother and son looked at each other for a long time. The little fellow stretched out his arms and shouted, Mommy, hug me. Shin Manting's heart suddenly softened. Her lips unconsciously curled into a smile, and she reached out to hug him. Manting is back. Nanny He's eyes were slightly red. I'm glad you're back. I'm glad you're back. Shin Manting blinked her eyes in confusion. Shin Luoan reminded her, This is Nanny He. Hello, Nanny He. Shin Manting greeted her obediently and quickly followed Shin Luo and into the room with the infant in her arms. This is our room. Shin Luoan stood up straight and pointed to a small bed inside. The baby sleeps there. Shin Manting nodded. Are we going to sleep here? As he spoke, he walked over and looked at the big bed. But when she turned around, she saw Shin Luo's slightly strange expression. Shin Manting thought she had said something wrong. She hugged the baby and shrank her head. She whispered, Aren't Daddy and Mommy supposed to sleep together? She didn't have parents, but the parents of other children slept in the same room, on the same bed. Shin Luoan's eyes softened. He nodded slightly. Yes. Shin Manting breathed a sigh of relief. She sat down with the baby in her arms and said, What a big bed. I've never slept in such a big bed before. Wow, it's so bouncy and comfortable. Manting, you're back? An old man's voice rang out. Shin Manting felt a sense of familiarity when she heard it. She put the baby down, stood up and walked out. When she saw the old woman walking toward her, she greeted, Grandma. Old Mrs. Shin immediately rushed forward and hugged Shin Manting with reddened eyes. It's good that you're back. It's good that you're back. You're finally out of the hospital. Let Luoan take you out for a walk. Yeah. Shin Manting smiled slyly and said, Hubby said he's taking me out for a feast today. Hubby? Nanny He couldn't help turning around to take a second look at the way she addressed him. The others had already seen how thorough Shin Manting's amnesia was, so they were not surprised by it. Old Mrs. Shin nodded and said, All right, go ahead then. Luoan, take good care of Manting. Okay. Shin Luoan chuckled. I won't be bringing little Moon along. Just watch. Okay. Old Mrs. Shin's eyes curved into crescents as she smiled. Manting was finally as obedient as she was now. Of course, he had to create more opportunities for them to be alone together. He took Shin Manting for a stroll around the neighborhood of the house. Everything he saw was new and interesting. She didn't reject Shin Luo and holding her hand. His palm was soft and warm. She was just too skinny. Let's go. Okay. Shin Manting agreed happily and got into his car. Hubby, will it be just the two of us? Yes. Shin Luoan glanced at her, his eyes full of tenderness. This is called a world of the two of us. Shin Manting blushed when she heard that. She asked in a low voice, Are we going on a date? Shin Luoan chuckled. He leaned over and said, Yes, come closer. Chapter 2047. Shin Luo's heart warmed when he saw her pouting little mouth in front of him. He lowered his head slightly, and gently kissed her lips. He gently held her in his arms and felt her obviously too thin body. His heart ached a little. He reached out and pulled the seat belt behind her. He let go of her and said, "I'll take you to eat your favorite food." Shin Manting's cheeks were red, and she was very happy. She nodded and looked at Shen Luo, and with a pair of shining eyes, she said sincerely, "Honey, you're so nice. Honey, you're so nice." It was impossible for Shen Manting to utter those words, but she could hear them clearly from the side. Shen Luo's hands trembled slightly when he buckled her seatbelt. If she knew how much she used to hate him, would she still say such words? Would she still say good things about him? Would she still call him husband? There was no doubt about the answer. But soon it returned to normal. "Let's go." "Okay." The car drove steadily to the Western restaurant that Shen Manting used to like to go to in the past. He ordered her favorite dishes. Shen Manting looked around curiously, as if she had never seen it before. She leaned forward and whispered, "Honey, is our family very rich?" Shen Luoan chuckled. "Why do you ask? One look, and you can tell that this is a very expensive place. I just looked at the menu, and it costs more than $500 for a steak. It's so expensive. When I was obedient, Uncle Dean only gave me 10 cents to buy candy." Shen Manting felt a little wronged as she spoke, but soon she covered her mouth and said timidly, "Honey, am I too childish?" Shen Luo and felt a slight pain in his heart and looked at her sadly. He shook his head against his will and said, "No, it's very good." Shen Manting vaguely felt that he was lying, but she didn't expose him. Nodding his head, he quietly sat up straight and still. Soon the dishes were served. There was only one steak on a very fragrant and high-end plate. Shen Manting opened her eyes wide, but didn't say anything. After the waiter left, she said, "Honey, it's even more beautiful than what I saw on TV." Shen Luoan chuckled and picked up the knife and fork. "Come on, I'll teach you how to cut it." "Yes." Shen Manting beamed. She looked at Shen Luo's expression and demonstrated it to him, and he quickly followed her advice, just like she knew how to use it. After a hearty meal, Shen Luoan and Shen Manting went shopping. He bought a lot of clothes. Shen Manting was too thin now. After choosing 2 sets of clothes, she tugged at Shen Luoan and said, "Honey, I've just woken up. The smallest one is already too big for me. Don't buy it now. I'll buy it again when I gain some weight." Shen Luoan nodded with a smile. Returning home was a rewarding journey. Shen Yueshao had already fallen asleep. Shen Luo and Shen Manting crept into the room quietly. "Go take a shower first. I'll get you your pajamas," Shen Luoan said. "Okay." Shen Manting didn't dare to speak too loudly and quickly walked into the bathroom. However, he was dazzled by the spacious bathroom and exclaimed, "It's too big." Shen Luo was holding her pajamas. When he heard this, he smiled and asked, "Do you know how to shower?" Shen Manting looked at him as if he was retarded. "Do you think I'm stupid?" She took the pajamas and pushed him out. "Don't peek at me." The smile on Shen Luo's face widened. He nodded with a smile and said, "I'll wait for you." Shen Manting's face turned red. Chapter 2048. Her heart was beating fast. Shen Manting was in a good mood. She hummed a tune, took off her clothes and entered the shower room. She turned on the water and tested the temperature before she suddenly realized that something was wrong. When she was in the orphanage, she used to boil water for bathing. Why did she know how to use such an advanced thing here? Shen Manting suddenly felt a little excited and muttered, "It seems that I'm really a genius." While she was happily bathing, she touched her small chest. The bulge seemed so big. She couldn't hold it with one hand. She was so thin. How did it grow? After bathing awkwardly, she found that her body was different everywhere. After a while, Shen Manting put on clean pajamas and walked out. Her wet hair was wrapped up. Shen Luoan didn't know what he was doing. When he saw her come out, he seemed to hide something under the quilt. Shen Manting blushed and shouted, "Honey, what are you doing?" "Nothing." Shen Luoan stood up. "Dry your hair. Don't catch a cold." "I won't." Shen Manting waved her arm. "There's a heater in the room. It's not cold. Sit down." "Okay." Shen Manting sat on the bed and couldn't help but look under the quilt curiously. Shen Luoan noticed her little movement, but he pretended not to see it. He removed the towel from her head and slowly dried her hair. The heater in the room was on, and soon her hair was half dry. Shen Luo and quickly went to take a shower, and Shen Manting immediately reached out to the quilt. She felt a small box. The box was made of black velvet and felt smooth and comfortable. She opened the box, and inside was a ring. It was a big, shiny diamond in the shape of a heart. Shen Manting's eyes lit up. She couldn't help but pick it up and put it on her finger. Almost automatically, she put it on the ring finger of her left hand. There was no flesh on her finger, so it was easy to put on. It was very loose and dangled on her finger. But for some reason, she suddenly felt an unknown place and her heart began to ache. She suddenly felt a little sad. She stared at the ring, and her eyes were a little hot. An urge to cry was difficult to suppress. It came crazily, but inexplicably. He quietly put the ring back and continued to stuff it under the blanket, pretending that he had not touched it at all. But when she fell onto the bed, she couldn't help but burst into tears. She whimpered softly. Her heart was empty, very empty. When Shen Luoan came out, Shen Manting was already asleep on the bed. The position was in the middle. The lights were still on, very bright. However, she was sleeping soundly. Her even breathing could be heard, almost in sync with her son's. He walked up quietly and subconsciously touched the ring he had just placed on the table. It's still there. He was a little disappointed, but he quickly placed the ring in the drawer of the bedside table. He turned off the lights and lay down. There was a faint sense of satisfaction and joy in his heart. He reached out and gently pulled her into his embrace. Shen Manting was asleep. When she sensed his breath, she couldn't help but lean forward and reach out to grab his clothes. "Honey, I feel so sad." Shen Luoan's body stiffened. He placed his hand on her cheek and asked softly, "What's wrong?" Chapter 2049. Shen Luoan's body stiffened when he heard this. His heart ached, and he looked down at her face. The room was dark, but he could still clearly feel the tears on Shen Manting's face. She was different from before. She was different at all. In the past, Shen Manting would cry with a smile. It was ugly and cruel. But now she was crying. She was just crying. She was different. She was different. Shen Luoan silently pulled her into his arms and hugged her tightly. Shen Manting subconsciously leaned over and wrapped her arms around him. She rubbed against his chest. His body smelled faintly of shampoo. It was warm. Shen Luoan gently patted her back and whispered, "Don't think about anything. Go to sleep." "Okay." Shen Manting closed her eyes and soon fell into a deep sleep. Shen Luoan hugged her and his heart ached. He closed his eyes, but his mind was in a mess and he couldn't sleep. Early morning. Shen Manting's body ached from sleeping and she stretched. But when she turned around, she saw Shen Luoan looking at her. His amber eyes were clear and quiet. Shen Manting was startled, and her body twitched. Then she shrank back and her cheeks were a little hot. "Good morning, honey." Shen Luoan smiled and said, "Good morning." Shen Manting immediately got up and went to the bathroom. She closed the door and was in a good mood. After washing up, she walked out and saw Shen Luo undressing the child. Shen Yueshao saw Shen Manting coming out and called out with a smile, "Mom!" Shen Manting walked over and touched the little boy's head. "Good boy." The little boy was a little happy. He opened his arms and rubbed them in Shen Manting's direction. "Give me a hug." Shen Manting squatted down and picked up the little boy. "Let's go. Mom will take you to dinner." "Okay." Shen Yueshao was very happy and hugged Shen Manting's neck. Shen Luoan smiled with relief when he saw it, but then he reminded her, "You haven't brushed your teeth yet. Help little Moon brush his teeth first." Shen Manting was shocked. "He's so young and he's already brushing his teeth? Of course you have to brush your teeth. It won't hurt so much when you're changing your teeth." Shen Luoan tapped her nose. "You have to instill good education and habits in your child." "Oh." Shen Manting held the baby in her arms. "Let's go then. Does he know how to do it?" "Yes." Little Moon had already spoken up. "Mommy, I can brush my teeth." Shen Manting couldn't help but exclaim, "He's indeed a doctor's child." She carried him into the bathroom and said, "Let's go." From today onwards, she would learn to be a good mother. Be a good mother. No matter what, she must have given birth to this child. Otherwise, how could he look so much like her? Moreover, he was adorable no matter how she looked at him. She could get a son without having to suffer any pain. It was worth it. But just as this thought flashed through his mind, he heard the child's voice. P. Shin Manting froze and looked at him. Little Moon pouted and said, Mommy P. She looked at Shin Luoan and said, Dear, the baby wants to pee. Shin Luoan chuckled when he saw her pleading look. He took the baby from her arms and said, Go and have breakfast first. I'll clean up for your baby. Okay, Shin Manting replied and turned around. She felt sweet inside and said, I'll wait for you. Chapter 2050. When Shin Manting walked out, the whole family was already outside. A young woman was sitting next to Shin Julia. She looked very lively and beautiful. When she saw Shin Manting, her eyes lit up and she exclaimed, Manting. Shin Manting was a little flattered. She stepped back and said, I'm Yi Qianqian. Yi Qianqian pointed to herself, and then to Shin Julia, Shin Julia's wife. As she spoke, she hugged Shin Manting excitedly. You're finally awake. That's great. Yi Qianqian's eyes were a little red. She patted her back and said in a choked voice, Everything will be fine. Shin Manting suddenly didn't know how to react. She laughed and said, Cece, I'm hungry. Oh. Yi Qianqian immediately released her and smiled happily. Well, let's eat together. Yi Qianqian held Shin Manting's hand and walked to the table. Shin Manting looked around and called out, Dad, Mom, Grandma. The people who were called all smiled. Mrs. Shin smiled and said, Don't be so formal at home. Well, eat more. Look at how thin you are. Old Mrs. Shun's heart ached for her. She handed her a bowl and asked, When will your body be as fair and plump as it used to be? Shin Manting glanced at her body. Fair and plump? She had never experienced what it felt like to be fair and plump. So she had been fair and plump before? Shin Manting sat down and nodded. She was a little touched. When they were halfway through eating, Shin Luoan came out with his son. Little Moon was bouncing up and down. When he saw Shin Manting, he called out, Mom! Shin Manting's eyes softened and she nodded. Shin Luo, and carried him to the dining table and sat down. He said, Who else hasn't been called? Grandpa, Grandma. After greeting Grandpa and Grandma in a childish voice, his eyes fell on old Mrs. Shen. He blinked and called out, Grandma. Shen Luoan chuckled and pinched his little face. He corrected, Great-Grandma. Take Grandma. He shouted loudly, but it wasn't accurate. Everyone laughed. Old Mrs. Shen smiled and gave him a cup of soy milk. Say it again. Take Grandma. Yi Qianqian couldn't stop laughing and asked, What about me? What about me? Little Moon tilted his head and thought for a moment, but he still didn't know what to say. He looked at Shin Luoan for help. Daddy. Shin Luoan chuckled and greeted, Aunt. Little Moon called out softly, Sun. Auntie, Yi Qianqian corrected her. Lift your tongue, Auntie. Little Moon looked a little helpless, as if he knew that he had called out the wrong name. He shrunk his head and whispered, Sun. Yi Qianqian gave up, and gave him a small bun. Be good. Xiao Yuer took it from her and beamed with joy. Shin Luoan bowed his head and said, Thank you, Aunt. Xie Sun. The whole family couldn't help but laugh. Shin Julia finally walked over, and chuckled helplessly. Calling Mom and Dad is quite smooth, but calling anyone else is no good. Uncle. Little Moon looked at Shin Julia excitedly, and called out to him. Shin Julia laughed and said, You're smart. Little Moon knew that he had been praised and swung his legs happily. Our Little Moon can talk about other things. Shin Luo, and sat beside him and said, What do you want to say to Mommy? Little Moon smiled and pointed at Shin Luoan. Then he shouted, Mommy, Little Moon is here to see you. Chapter 2051. It was a very familiar sentence. It was as if she had heard it countless times when she was asleep. After the young child finished speaking, he laughed happily. He took a bite of the little bun in his hand and smiled happily. She felt a lump in her throat, and had the urge to cry. Shen Luo, and seemed to notice Shin Manting's gaze and looked at her. His eyes were a little soft, and he looked at her with a smile on his face. After breakfast, Shen Luo and handed the baby to Yi Qianqian. After getting her full assurance, he led Shin Manting out. Shin Manting sat in the driver's seat. This time, she had learned to be smart. She buckled her seatbelt and looked at Shin Luoan. Honey, where are we going today? To the orphanage. Shin Luoan glanced at her. Back to the orphanage. Shin Manting opened her eyes wide and said, Are we going to the orphanage? Yes. Shin Manting was a little scared after getting a positive answer. She slid her hand on the seat belt and asked, Why are we going back? To find your good friend. Shen Luoan looked at her. Do you remember what you told me your name? Shin Manting felt a little strange when she heard this. After thinking for a while she said, He Yunsuan. Was that your name when you were in the orphanage? Shin Manting nodded and looked at the expression on Shin Luoan's face. She felt a little scared and asked, What's wrong? What about Zhang Meifang? She is my good friend. Shin Manting was very sure. Honey, you have asked this question twice. The last time was in the ward a few days ago. He and Shin Jilia were asking this question. When it came to this question, both of their expressions didn't look too good. They were indescribably solemn. Could it be that there was a problem? Shin Manting looked at him. But Shen Luoan didn't say anything. He said, Sit tight. Okay. Shin Manting was already seated. I'm ready. Shen Luoan glanced at her, started the car and sped away. By the time they arrived at the orphanage, almost an hour had passed. During this hour, Shen Manting looked out of the window and played with her phone from time to time. He stopped the car and turned off the GPS. We're here, he said. Shin Manting looked up and exclaimed, Hubby, why has this place become so run down? It's been 19 years. Of course it will change. Shen Luoan unbuckled his seatbelt. Let's go. When Shin Manting got out of the car, the sun was blazing. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the two children sitting at the door. The two children looked to be only 5 or 6 years old. When they saw Shin Luoan's car, their eyes lit up in surprise. Shin Manting felt a little sour in her heart. Finally, I'm not the one looking at other people's cars. Now these children are also looking at my car. Humph. She caught up with him, held his arm, and asked, Hubby, is the director still around? Shin Luoan asked. Is the director still around? Yes. Shin Luoan glanced at her. Do you remember which room it was? Shin Manting nodded and pulled Shin Luoan into the yard. The children were running around and playing games. Seeing these two strangers dressed so well, they couldn't help but take a few more glances. Director! Shin Manting shouted. Is the director around? Chapter 2052. Are you the dean? Shin Manting looked at the man in front of her, who was about the same age as Shin Luoan, and was surprised. The man looked at her and said, The dean is resting at the moment. Why are you looking for him? Shin Manting breathed a sigh of relief and said, I used to live here, and now I'm back to look for him. Oh, the man looked at Shin Manting and said, Who are you? Why do you look so familiar? However, he was too thin. He looked so thin that he was out of shape. She couldn't recognize him at all. When Shin Manting heard this, she smiled and said, Do you know me? I'm He Yunsuan. The man looked at her in surprise and said, Yunsuan? Really? Why are you? Why is he so thin? Yes. Shin Manting looked as usual, then glanced at Shin Luoan, took his arm and said, This is my husband, Shin Luoan. He's a scientist. The man was even more surprised. A scientist? No. Shin Luoan pressed Shin Manting's hand. I'm just researching some medicine. Is the old dean here? Oh, he's sleeping. The old man hasn't been in good health recently. The man kept glancing at Shin Manting as he spoke and said, Yunsuan has become so big. Time flies. Do you still remember who I am? Who? Shin Manting looked at him with her eyes wide open and frowned. She vaguely felt that he was a little familiar, but the difference from when he was a child was too big. Shin Manting couldn't recognize who he was at all. The man laughed and said, Don't you remember me? I'm He Junsheng. He Junsheng? Shin Manting covered her mouth. No way, how is it possible? He Junsheng touched his head with a little embarrassment. Yes, I've changed a little. Come on in and sit down. Shin Manting's face was still full of disbelief when she led the two in. Isn't he Junqing the silly little brother from before? You look so smart now. Shen Manting's memory stopped at the age of 12, so she didn't have many words in her mind. What he said at this moment was the truth of the heavens. Junqing felt even more embarrassed and said, "Ah yes." Shen Luo's lips curved into a smile. He pressed Shen Manting down and said, "She got into a car accident 2 years ago and was hospitalized for 2 years. She has some memory problems and can only remember things from before she was 12 years old." Junqing was stunned for a moment. Then he looked at Shen Manting with understanding in his eyes. He looked at her sympathetically and said, "Yunsuan is a very smart person. The headmaster likes him very much. I'll go see if the headmaster has woken up." "Wait a minute." Shen Luoan stopped him. "Since you grew up with her, you should know a lot about her. Let's talk first." Junqing looked at Shen Manting and nodded. "Have a seat. I'll make you some tea." Shen Luo was indeed a little thirsty, so he didn't refuse. Shen Manting made herself at home and pulled Shen Luo to sit on the bone stool. The decoration of the house was very old, and the furniture seemed to be from more than 10 years ago. Shen Manting looked around and suddenly stood up. She said, "Hubby, Meifang and I drew a butterfly here. Come and take a look." Shen Luoan stood up and walked over. Sure enough, he saw the shallow marks. There were 2 butterflies, one crooked and the other dancing. There was a signature at the bottom, and it was written Zhang Meifang at the bottom. On the butterfly that looked slightly better, it was written He Yunsuan. There was also a smiling face at the bottom. The marks were very shallow, and it was obvious that a long time had passed. The orphanage was not big, and the decoration was very old. Shen Luo looked around and saw that Junqing had already brought the tea set. Shen Luo pulled Shen Manting back to sit down. Junqing smiled and said, "It's been a long time since we had a guest." The tea set was left for a while, and it was just washed. After boiling the water, Junqing looked at Shen Manting and said, "She just woke up, didn't she? She's too thin." "Yes, she woke up a few days ago." Shen Luo looked at him. "But are you sure she's He Yunsuan?" "Yes." Junqing looked at her. "She's witty and clever. She's obviously powerful. Who else could it be if not Yunsuan? Then what about Zhang Meifang?" Shen Luo asked. At the mention of this name, Junqing was quite emotional. Meifang is quiet and seems to be quiet. She's not very smart. Compared to Yunsuan, she's far behind. Where is she? She disappeared when she was a teenager. I don't know where she went. At that time, I called the police and looked for the surveillance cameras, but they couldn't find her anywhere. Junqing disinfected the tea set when the water was boiling. It's a pity. Meifang is kind and good-looking. Back then, my grandmother came to adopt her. Shen Luo looked at him. At that time, she found someone based on her horoscope, and the person she adopted was Zhang Meifang. Junqing's teacup trembled, and the cup fell. The boiling water splashed and sprayed Shen Manting's fingers. Shen Manting shrank her hand in pain and hurriedly covered it. Shen Luo was shocked. He pulled her hand over and quickly checked it. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." Shen Manting was a little embarrassed. She pushed his hand away and looked at Junqing. "Junqing, can't you find Meifang now?" Junqing suddenly looked a little flustered and said, "Who's here?" A slightly old voice was heard. An old man who looked to be in his 50s or 60s walked over. Shen Manting recognized him at a glance. "Uncle Dean." She stood up and walked over to him to help him. When Uncle Dean saw Shen Manting, he was stunned. "You are Yunsuan." Shen Manting said her name without any hesitation. The moment she said it, the look on the dean's face changed a little. He subconsciously glanced at Shen Luo and asked, "Who is this?" "My husband." Shen Manting smiled and helped the old man to sit down beside the chair. "Long time no see." "Yes, long time no see." The dean smiled, but he looked a little uncomfortable. "I haven't been here for a long time. You're here for?" "Dean, I want to know where Zhang Meifang is." The dean's expression changed. "Zhang Meifang." Junqing looked at him and frowned. "Dean, it's okay." Meifang was adopted." The dean felt a little guilty. She hasn't been back for many years. Didn't she get lost? Shen Luo asked. Mr. He just said that Zhang Meifang got lost when she was a teenager. Moreover, you said that she was adopted. When she became an adult, she was adopted by our family again. What's going on? The person they wanted to adopt was Zhang Meifang. Chapter 2053. The person they wanted to adopt was Zhang Meifang. In the end, they adopted He Yunsuan instead. Grandma would never lie to her family, so there was only one explanation. Grandma had been deceived. According to He Junsheng, Zhang Meifang had long been lost. In the end, when Grandma went to look for her, the orphanage replaced Zhang Meifang with He Yunsuan. Why did they do that? The director was sweating profusely when he heard this. He panicked and said, "You are. My name is Shen Luoan." Shen Luoan took out his business card. The director held the white business card in his hand and couldn't help but feel nervous. My grandmother adopted a girl named Zhang Meifang from this orphanage. As Shen Luoan spoke, he paid close attention to the director's expression. My grandmother firmly believed that she was my missing sister, who had been missing for more than 10 years. When she came to look for her, she brought along her birth date. Later, when she did a paternity test, she discovered that she had nothing to do with our family. The director looked up at him and said, "Maybe it was a mistake." "Yes, we thought so too," Shen Luoan said slowly. But this time, Manting got into a car accident and was bedridden for 2 years. When she woke up, she only remembered things before she was 12 years old and believed that her name was He Yunsuan. Then what about Zhang Meifang? The more the director listened, the more nervous he became. He Junsheng looked at the director and sighed softly. "Uncle Director, I just told him that Meifang went missing when she was 14 years old." The director looked at He Junsheng in disbelief. "You?" He Junsheng lowered his head guiltily. "I forgot about that for a moment. I'm sorry." Sigh. The director put down the business card and looked sad. "Mr. Shen, I'm sorry." "What do you mean?" When she was ready to adopt Meifang, she had already gone missing. At that time, she used Meifang's date of birth to look for her. The director looked sad. At that time, the orphanage was poor. She said that if she could find her granddaughter, she would give us 100,000 yuan as a token of appreciation. "So you lied to my grandmother?" Shen Luoan frowned slightly. "Does the date of birth that my grandmother provided match Meifang's?" The president nodded. "That's right. At that time, I was muddle-headed. I wanted the $100,000, and I wanted Yun Siyuan to live a good life. So I asked Yun Siyuan to pretend to be Meifang and go to your house." As he spoke, he looked at Shen Manting. Shen Manting's eyes were already brimming with tears. "What about Meifang?" "I don't know." The director shook his head. "She was a young girl at that time. It's normal for her to be kidnapped and sold." After returning from the orphanage, Shen Manting was in low spirits. On his way here, he looked left and right. But when Shen Manting returned, she was speechless. She looked at Shen Luoan and asked, "Honey, is it possible that Meifang is your biological sister?" Shen Luoan glanced at Shen Manting and nodded. "Yes. Does that mean I can't be called Shen Manting anymore?" Shen Manting looked at Shen Luoan and said, "The real Shen Manting is Meifang, and I'm a fake. It's just like what they say on TV. We were replaced by a leopard cat. I'm the leopard cat, and Meifang is the crown prince." Chapter 2054. I'm not Shen Manting either. Shen Manting was a little disappointed. "I'm used to it. You all call me Manting, but Manting is gone. Can I still be Manting?" Shen Luoan sighed softly and glanced at her sideways. He held the steering wheel with one hand and held her hand with the other. Looking at the road ahead, he said slowly, "What are you talking about? No matter who you used to be, or who the real Shen Manting is, you are you now. You are Shen Manting. I'm just here to take a look, because I'm a genius. Honey, will you still be my husband in the future?" Shen Manting looked at him with a pair of big eyes full of doubt and expectation. Shen Luoan's heart fluttered when he suddenly heard this. He turned his head and looked into her dark and clear eyes. He felt a little choked. After a long time, he said softly, "As long as you want, we will always be husband and wife." Shen Manting's originally gloomy mood suddenly became joyful. With a smile on her face, She lowered her head and played with the hem of her dress. She said happily, "Of course I want to. We will always be husband and wife." Shen Luoan looked at her deeply and looked away. There was a dull pain in his chest, and his hands trembled slightly. Looking at the bright sky ahead, he said tentatively and pleadingly, "Then let's go to the Civil Affairs Bureau tomorrow." Huh? Shin Manting didn't hear clearly. "Honey, what did you say?" Looking at her clear and innocent eyes, Shen Luoan's courage suddenly shrank. His throat was a little dry, and he said, "Nothing." It was already afternoon when they returned to the city. Shen Manting was hungry, so he took her out for dinner. It was already 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they returned home. Because Shen Manting woke up, Shen Luo, and hadn't been to the laboratory for several days. Old Fifth made one call after another. In the end, Shen Luoan couldn't win against Lao Wu. He had to leave Shen Manting at home and go out. Before going out, Shen Manting seemed to be a little flustered and called out, "Honey." "Huh?" Shen Luoan turned around. "What's wrong? When will you be back?" "At night." Shen Luoan rubbed her little head and said softly, "I'll try to come back as soon as possible." "Oh." Shen Manting looked a little disappointed. "Can't you bring me along?" "Be good and stay at home. It'll be fine." Shen Luoan looked a little helpless. "You can spend some time with your son. You're his mother. You need to nurture your relationship with him." "All right." Shen Manting finally felt a little relieved. She tugged at his clothes reluctantly and said, "Then come back soon." "Okay." Shen Luo, and let go of her hand and turned around. But before he could take 2 steps, he heard another shout from behind. "Hubby." He turned around and saw Shen Manting running towards him with a flushed face. Shen Manting stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the lips. "I'll wait for you to come back," she said. Shen Luoan's heart was itching. He couldn't help it. He held her head with one hand and kissed her on the lips. His nimble and powerful tongue probed into her mouth and gently pried open her pearly white teeth. It pierced in slightly, tyrannically and greedily rolling her out, holding her tightly to him. His kiss was a little forceful. Shen Manting had never experienced such a feeling before. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. Chapter 2055. Shen Manting's heartbeat quickened, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around his waist. Shen Luoan couldn't help but push her against the door. Cough, cough. The woman's coughing successfully pulled him back to reality. When he released her, he noticed that her face was completely red. Wiping the water from the corner of his mouth, he lowered his head slightly. Shen Luoan's Adam's apple tightened when he saw her expression. Damn it! His body, which had been empty for 3 years, began to heat up uncontrollably. He looked behind Shen Manting and immediately saw Yi Qianqian. Yi Qianqian looked at him suggestively and said, "Big brother, isn't it a little inconvenient to do this at the doorstep? Why don't we return to our room?" Shen Manting's face turned even redder. She turned around and glared at Yi Qianqian shyly. She stomped her feet and said, "You're so mean." Her coquettish voice carried the annoyance and coquettishness of a young girl. Shen Luoan's heart melted as he listened. Yi Qianqian was stunned and subconsciously looked at Shen Manting's back. Then he couldn't help but sigh. It was indeed the consciousness of a little girl. Shen Luoan couldn't help but say, "Don't tease her. She's still young." Yi Qianqian replied, "Big brother, it really isn't appropriate to do it at the door." Shen Luoan was speechless. He turned around and said, "I'm going to work. Be careful on the road, big brother." Yi Qianqian waved at him. She closed the door and skipped toward her room. Shen Jilia was taking an afternoon nap. When he sensed Yi Qianqian enter, he didn't move. He looked up and breathed steadily. Yi Qianqian took off her shoes, lifted the covers and crawled into bed. She reached over and hugged Shen Jilia's waist. She straddled his lap and called out, "Old Shen, get up." Shen Jilia didn't open his eyes. He flipped over in her position and hugged her face to face. Yi Qianqian felt a little defeated and continued, "Is it fun to dream?" Shen Jilia was speechless. "More fun than me?" Shen Jilia opened his eyes and asked, "Do you miss me?" Yi Qianqian's lips curled up, but before she could finish, Shen Jilia pounced on her like a wolf. "Ah!" Yi Qianqian screamed with laughter and shouted, "Wait! I have something to say." Shin Jilia pinned her under his body and held her firmly between his legs as he said, I'm going to play with you now. Wait a minute, I'm just kidding. Yi Qianqian exclaimed. Shin Jilia kissed her on the mouth and murmured, It's too late. Oh. Yi Qianqian's words were completely swallowed by him. When she was feeling dizzy from the kiss, she pushed his face away and said, Guess what I just saw? What? Shin Jilia was tugging at her clothes, trying his best to pull them off and throw them away. However, after a few tugs, Yi Qianqian refused to cooperate. She frowned and shouted, Get up for a second. Yi Qianqian arched her back, and Shin Jilia finally managed to pull the sweater off. I saw Big Brother kissing Manting. Yi Qianqian wrapped her arms around his neck. But Manting is obviously still a child. Doesn't Big Brother feel like he's molesting a child? Shin Jilia's originally serious face couldn't help but burst out laughing. He lifted the blanket up and hugged her exposed head. He pressed his lips against her neck and whispered, What are you thinking about? Sister Manting is 2 years older than me. Oh, you didn't see it. She just... Oh. Yi Qianqian's words were cut off. Chapter 2056. At first, Yi Qianqian still had the strength to deal with his fierce attacks. But then she completely fell under his passion. Slow down. Shin Jilia worked very hard and didn't stop for a moment. When it was almost over, he whispered into her ear, I want a child. Yi Qianqian narrowed her eyes and hugged him. Her eyes were wet and she whispered, This is not a reason for you to indulge. Hurry. Get. Shin Jilia laughed out loud and kissed her more passionately. Shin Manting originally wanted to ask Yi Qianqian something. But when she walked to the door, she heard faint sounds coming from inside. He didn't deliberately try to cover it up. Even though his voice was pitifully soft through the door, Shin Manting could still hear him clearly as she stood close to the door. For some reason, her hand that was about to knock on the door suddenly stopped. His cheeks began to heat up slightly, and images that made him blush immediately popped up in his mind like a conditioned reflex. She obviously hadn't seen it, but she knew it clearly. Shin Manting withdrew her hand and turned to return to her room. She picked up her phone and after studying it for a while, she finally opened the browser. She saw 2 words, search. She clicked on it, and a keyboard page automatically popped up. She touched it with her finger and poked a few times. She typed, How to make your husband happy. She clicked on it, and the first line was, 10 little things to make your husband happy. After reading back and forth for a long time, Shin Manting blushed and closed the page. Shen Luoan came back very late that night. It was almost 11 p.m. When he opened the door, the room was dark. There was no doubt that the child had fallen asleep. However, when he walked in and was about to turn on the lights in the room suddenly lit up. Shen Luoan was startled. When he came back to his senses, he saw Shin Manting in her pajamas standing next to the switch. Husband, you're back. Shin Manting went up to him. Let me help you take off your coat. Shin Luoan was a little flattered and looked at her. Shin Manting had already reached out to touch his coat and smoothly took off his clothes. Then she hung up the coat and said, Sit down for a while. I'll help you run the bath. Shin Luoan looked at her strangely and asked, What's wrong? When Shin Manting heard this, her cheeks became a little hot and she said, I just want to help you run the bath. Then he walked in. The sound of running water came from the bathroom, and Shin Luoan's heart warmed slightly. Shin Manting walked in and sat beside the bathtub. She stared blankly at the clear hot water flowing down. When he heard the footsteps, he immediately stood up. Shin Luoan stared at her and walked in leisurely. What's wrong with you today? When Shin Manting heard his question, she lowered her head in embarrassment and said, Nothing. I just want to be a good wife. She looked up at him with her clear eyes and said, Hubby, from today onwards, I'm going to run the bathtub for you every day. I don't know how to make breakfast at work, but I can help you with your tie. As he spoke, the light in his eyes became even more mesmerizing. Shin Luoan stared at the cute little woman in front of him. His heart couldn't help but flutter. I still have to learn how to make love lunchboxes. Ah. Shin Manting swallowed her words. She was startled by his sudden embrace. What's wrong? Shen Luoan hugged her tightly. Shin Manting didn't know if it was an illusion, but she actually felt that. He was afraid. But wasn't he a man? What would a man be afraid of? Chapter 2057. Shin Luoan hugged her tightly. Shin Manting didn't know if it was an illusion, but she felt that. He was afraid. But wasn't he a man? What would a man be afraid of? Shin Manting didn't understand. She hugged the man and whispered, "Honey." The room was silent. There was only the sound of the bathtub running water in the bathroom. Shin Luoan hugged her and whispered, "Manting, I love you." His voice was very low, and there was an almost inaudible quiver in it. Shin Manting was slightly stunned when she heard this. She should be happy, but she didn't know why she felt a little sad. She felt that Shin Luoan was hugging her tighter. She groaned and whispered, "Honey, you're too tight. I'm uncomfortable." Shin Luoan released her slightly when he heard this. Shin Manting noticed that Shin Luoan's eyes were a little red. Her heart ached, and she felt a little sad. Shin Manting pouted and looked at Shin Luoan. "Honey, what's wrong with you today?" "It's nothing." Shin Luoan combed her hair behind her ear and whispered, "I'm very happy." Shin Manting saw the slight smile on his lips and felt a little better. "Well, as long as you're happy, I'll do this for you every day in the future." Shin Manting smiled and put her hands on his shoulders. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him. "I love you too." After saying this, she felt a little sweet in her heart. With a smile on his lips, he quickly ran out. She held the door handle and looked at him deeply when she was about to close it. After a moment, she turned around and her heart was beating fast. "I'm in love," Shin Manting said to herself. Her face was hot and her mood was high. Shin Luoan stood in the bathroom for a long time before he turned to look at the bathtub. The water was running fast, and it was almost full. "I just want to be a good wife." Her simple and shy words made Shin Luoan's heart beat faster. How nice. When he came out of the shower, Shin Manting was already asleep. He gently lifted the quilt and got into bed. Shin Luoan gently wrapped his arm around her waist. Shin Manting sensed his arrival and snuggled into his arms. She breathed heavily in his arms, relying on him and greedily. Shin Luoan smiled and quickly closed his eyes. The baby woke up early the next morning. A childish voice called out in a childish voice, "Daddy." Shin Luoan woke up immediately. Shin Yueshao was standing on the child's bed, leaning against the railing and looking at him pitifully. Shin Luoan subconsciously glanced at Shin Manting. She was still asleep, but he didn't know what she was dreaming about. There was a faint smile on her lips. Shin Luoan stood up quietly, picked up his son, and walked inside. After her son was done peeing, she helped the little boy brush his teeth, wash his face, and change his clothes. Shin Manting slowly woke up after everything was done. When he stood up, he was shocked to find that the father and son were already neatly dressed. Looking at the time, it was already 7:30. She quickly got up and said, "Hubby, I woke up late. Why didn't you wake me up?" "Nothing much. Go back to sleep if you're tired." Shin Luoan walked over with the baby in his arms. "Call me Mommy. Mommy." The little boy reached out to Shin Manting. "Give me a hug." Shin Manting hugged him and said regretfully, "I wanted to help you shave and tie your tie, but I can't do that today." Shin Luoan's gaze softened. He held her chin and kissed her on the lips. Chapter 2058. Shin Manting's cheeks were pink, and she shrank back. When Shin Luoan saw her like this, he couldn't help but lean forward and say, "I don't mind." Shin Manting's face turned even redder. I mind." Then she glanced at Shin Luoan and the child and said, "I'm going to brush my teeth." After getting out of bed, Shin Manting hurried into the bathroom. She touched her face. It was burning hot. My husband is so dirty. I didn't even brush my teeth. And he kissed me just like that." Shin Manting looked at herself in the mirror and took a whiff of her breath. "It seems okay." After washing up, Shin Manting walked out and saw Shin Jilia playing with a tablet with the little boy in his arms. "Do you know what this is?" Shin Jilia whispered and pointed to a watermelon. "Tell me." Shin Yueshao looked at it for a long time, then pointed to it and said, "Eat." Shinjilia smiled and rubbed his head, saying, "You know it's eat. You're smart. What about this?" "Mom." Xiao Yuer called out. He was very excited to see Shin Manting. He struggled to get down from Shinjilia's lap and shouted, "Mommy!" Shinjilia put him down and sighed. "This little boy doesn't want me now that he has a mother. Little ingrate." Little Moon ran over and hugged Shin Manting with a smile. He jumped up and down and shouted, "Mommy!" Shin Manting picked up the little boy and was in a good mood. She looked at Shinjilia and asked, "Where's my husband?" Well, Shinjilia was still very unfamiliar with the way Shin Manting addressed him. He lowered his head and touched his nose, saying, "He just went out. He should be in the garden." "Okay, thank you." Shin Manting walked out with Little Moon in her arms, looking very motherly. Shinjilia looked at her back and said with a sigh, "You've really changed. Right, I wasn't wrong, right?" When Yi Qianqian came out, she heard Shinjilia's voice. She reached out and pulled him up to sit down, saying, "My father doesn't seem to be in good health recently. I called him, but he was either sleeping or coughing. I asked him what happened, but he didn't tell me. Old Shin, let's go back to Yin Town to see him." "Sure." Shinjilia looked at her. "I'll drop by Kingstown on the way to see Lily's children." "Humph." Yi Qianqian gave him a look of disdain. "You never forget to take care of the children wherever you go." Shinjilia stood up and gently nudged her shoulder with his. He winked at her and said, "I like it." His feminine voice gave Yi Qianqian goosebumps. He rubbed his arms and hurriedly walked to the dining table. "Let's go tomorrow. I'm worried that Dad might get sick. You should ask for leave from the hospital." "So urgent." Shinjilia picked up his phone. "All right, let's go. Tomorrow is Saturday. Come back on Wednesday." Yi Qianqian looked at him and smiled brightly. "Okay." How could Shinjilia refuse? With a chuckle he replied, "All right." When Shin Manting walked out with the baby in her arms, Shen Luo and was indeed standing in the garden. He seemed to be pulling out weeds for an unknown plant. His movements were slow and elegant, and he looked like he was taking his time. "Daddy!" Little Moon was already one step ahead of her and shouted. He swung his legs in Shin Manting's arms. The little boy wasn't heavy, but he was still quite strong. Shin Manting couldn't carry him anymore. She loosened her grip and bent down to put him down. Chapter 2059. Shin Manting couldn't help but rub her sore hands. Shin Luoan saw it and stood up, patted the dust off his hands and asked, "What's wrong?" "My hands are sore." Shin Manting rubbed her arms and glanced at Little Moon, who was squatting on the ground to pull weeds. "The little guy is quite heavy. Don't hold him for too long in the future." Shin Luoan patted the dust off his hands, reached out to hold her arm, and slowly rubbed it for her. "Your hand was injured, and it may be very uncomfortable if it bears heavy weights for too long." "Oh!" Shin Manting bit her lip and chuckled. "I know. Let's go and take our son back for breakfast." "I want to go for a walk." Shin Manting looked at him. "Honey, take me for a walk. I haven't been around here much." In the past few days, Shen Luoan had driven her out. However, she had never been out of the neighborhood. Occasionally, she felt that the neighborhood was very familiar, but it was indeed very strange. Hearing Shin Manting's request, Shen Luoan glanced at her, and his heart was slightly moved. Take a walk in the neighborhood. If they walked in the neighborhood, they would inevitably pass by the small park and the basketball court. Shin Manting's desperate hysteria on that night 2 years ago still seemed to echo in his ears. He would never forget that look for the rest of his life. In the face of her expectant and longing gaze, Shen Luo and was a little afraid to look at it. Soon he looked away. He looked at his son, who was squatting on the ground and playing with weeds, and said slowly, "Let's have breakfast first. There's nothing to see around here." "Oh." Shin Manting looked a little disappointed. "Then let's go in first." Shin Luoan didn't dare to look at her, and responded in a low voice. When it was time for breakfast, Shinjilia and Yi Qianqian were almost done. Shinjilia stood up, and before he left, he suddenly remembered something and said, "Brother, I'm going back to Yun Town with Qianqian tomorrow. Don't go to the laboratory for the next 2 days. Stay at home with the child and sister-in-law." "Sister-in-law?" These two words came out of Shun Jilia's mouth, and it was indescribably pleasing to the ear. She couldn't help but glance at him and say, "Got it. You can go. You haven't been taking care of my child for long, so don't take credit here." "Hey!" Shun Jilia wiped the corner of his mouth and said with a look of helplessness and disdain, "You're burning the bridge after crossing the river. Before sister-in-law woke up, Chantian dad and I took care of him together. You're always running around in the laboratory, and little you are almost doesn't recognize his father anymore." Little Moon raised his head when he heard his name being called. He looked at Shun Jilia, and then at Shun Luoan. Her little hand was holding a plastic spoon, and she was chewing on the porridge. Shun Jilia looked at him and clicked his tongue. "Look at your table manners. Look at how you're eating." Little Moon ignored him and lowered his head to continue eating. "That's enough. Let's go." Shun Luoan couldn't stand it anymore. "You're affecting my son's meal by standing here." Shun Jilia replied, "You're heartless." He left quickly. When Shun Jilia entered the room, Yi Chantian was packing her clothes. When she saw Shun Jilia come in, Yi Chantian didn't even look up and said, "It shouldn't be too cold in Yin Town. Oh, by the way, Tong Tong is getting married next month. She wants us to go together." "No," Shun Jilia said without hesitation. "What does her marriage have to do with me?" Chapter 2060. We're friends after all. Why don't we go when we get married? Yi Chantian glanced at him. "You're a man. Why are you so petty?" "I'm not going." Shun Jilia looked as if there was no room for negotiation. "But who is she married?" "Oh, her colleague in the company. He looks quite honest." "You've met him?" "I've seen his picture." Yi Chantian folded the clothes and put them in her suitcase. "I think he's pretty good. Tisk. That's why I say you women only know how to bully honest people." "What did honest people do?" Yi Chantian said. "Tong Tong is also very honest. Other than her current husband, she hasn't had a boyfriend." Shun Jilia didn't say anything and helped her fold the clothes. "What time is it? Aren't you going to work?" Yi Chantian glanced at the time. "Buddy, it's 8:30. Shun Jilia placed the folded clothes on the bed and leaned over. "Kiss me." Yi Chantian replied. "No." "Kiss me." "No." Yi Chantian turned her head away in disgust and stuffed the folded clothes into her suitcase. Shun Jilia leaned forward. "Then I'll kiss you." As he said this, he leaned over and pinched her chin. Yi Chantian's face was straightened, and she was kissed. Yi Chantian's face was squeezed out of shape. She turned her head away, but Shun Jilia picked her up and threw her on the bed. Shun Jilia pressed his body down and held her hands in place as he kissed her. Let's go." Yi Chantian was still firmly trapped. After struggling for a while, she simply gave up. When Shun Jilia was in the mood for kissing, he opened his mouth and bit her. "Ouch." Shun Jilia didn't let go. He pulled away and said, "Are you really going to bite me?" "Humph." Yi Chantian didn't feel guilty when she saw him like this. She shouted, "Hurry up and go to work. How dare you bite me?" Shun Jilia clenched his teeth. With a fierce look on his face, he rubbed his hands together and looked like a hooligan. He touched her waist and shouted, "I'm not going to work." "Ah!" Yi Chantian screamed, but with a smile. "Go away, you pervert. You're committing adultery in broad daylight. So be it." Shun Jilia lifted her clothes. "I'm coming." Yi Chantian hugged his head and laughed. "In ancient times, you would be drowned in a pig cage." "Humph." Shun Jilia responded with a groan. He opened his mouth and sucked on her soft snow-white lips. However, just as he was about to eat, he heard a clear knock on the door. Both Shun Jilia and Yi Chantian froze and turned their heads to look. The white door was ajar, and the knocking continued. Shun Luoan's voice could be heard. "Can you close the door a little? There are children inside." Yi Chantian's face suddenly turned red. He kicked Shun Jilia away and said, "Be asterisk starred. How dare you not close the door?" Shun Jilia couldn't remember whether he had closed the door or not. After being kicked, his anger subsided a little. He straightened his clothes and got out of bed. Shun Luoan stood nearby, and Shun Manting's face was already flushed. Shun Jilia was a little embarrassed. He coughed lightly and his cheeks were a little hot. He said awkwardly, "I was just joking. I'm about to go to work." Shen Luoan glanced at him. "You could have left a long time ago. You're a bad influence on children." Chapter 2061. Shen Jilya was even more embarrassed. He simply turned around and walked back without explaining. When he saw Yi Qianqian sitting there with a straight face, he coughed softly and said, "I told you not to stay at home. It's so embarrassing." Yi Qianqian raised her eyebrows and asked, "Who's to blame?" Shen Jilya said, "Me." Shen Jilya finally went to work. When he went out, Shen Luoan was not calm. His body, which had not been nourished for a long time, was extremely tense at this moment. In the past 3 years, he had also thought about it, but it had never been as turbulent as it was today. He tensed up and looked at Shen Manting. Shen Manting was too thin, and looked like she did not have much flesh. And no way. She would hate him. Shen Luoan took a long breath and walked back to the room. Shen Manting blushed a little, but when she saw him walking back to the room, she quickly followed him. Little Moon was squatting on the ground playing with a model plane, unaware of what had happened between the adults. Shen Manting called out, "Hubby." "Yes." Shen Luoan was very anxious, and when he saw her follow him in, he became even more restless. The anger that he had not felt for a long time surged, and the desire that had been suppressed for a long time was once again easily aroused. However, when he saw her innocent expression, he could only forcibly suppress his anger. He forced himself to calm down and looked at her asking, "What's wrong?" "I think Jilya and Qianqian are very happy. They look so happy every day." Shen Manting looked at him with a pair of sparkling eyes. She looked at him and said, "I think they are like a real husband and wife." When Shen Luoan heard this, he seemed to have read between the lines. He glanced at her and asked, "What do you think about us?" Shen Manting looked at him and said softly, "I don't think we are as husband and wife as they are. I always feel that something is missing." As she spoke, Shen Manting stepped forward and said, "That's why I think I want to be a good wife, but I still feel that something is missing." As she spoke, Shen Manting took another step forward. Shen Luo hurriedly took a step back and looked at her. His body was even more tense. Shen Manting's fair face was flushed as if she had applied rouge. She looked particularly charming. Her appearance was so cute that it made people want to directly crush her. His Adam's apple tightened. He averted his eyes and said, "Don't let your imagination run wild. We're fine." "No, I think there's something missing." Shen Manting was usually quite obedient, but for some reason, she seemed very stubborn today. "I think you know what it is, don't you?" Shen Manting took a step closer. "Hubby, you must know why. If Jilya and Qianqian can play like that, why don't you play with me?" Shen Luoan stepped back, not daring to look at her. He walked to the door and said, "We're not children anymore. There's nothing fun here. Jilya and sister-in-law are still children at heart. We've grown up and are adults. We can't be compared to them." Shen Luoan noticed that her eyes had turned red. Shen Manting looked as if something extremely heartbreaking had happened to her, and soon, big drops of tears fell from her eyes. "Jilya likes Qianqian, so he plays with her. You don't play with me because you don't like me, right?" Shen Manting sobbed. "You don't like me at all, do you?" Her simple and innocent words silenced Shen Luoan. After reading it, you can go and read the new book. It's also free. The cute, handsome, and tough male lead Big Lock. You won't be disappointed after reading it. It's so good. Chapter 2062. How could he not like her? It was precisely because he liked her so much that he was worried about her gains and losses. It was precisely because he loved her so much that he was afraid. Shen Luoan's chest ached, and the burning desire in his body subsided a little. The door of the room was open. Nanny he heard the movement inside, and came over to take a look. She was a little worried, but soon, she turned around and carried the child. Shen Luoan clearly sensed the movement behind him. He looked at Shen Manting in front of him and sighed softly. He walked up to her, and gently held her in his arms. Shen Manting sniffled, raised her hand to wipe her face, and hugged Shen Luoan tightly. "Manting." Shin Luo's voice sounded a little drawn out, with a soft sigh. When Shin Manting heard his voice and felt the clear warmth in front of her, her tears stopped. She buried her cheek in his arms and answered in a nasal voice. Hubby. It was a greeting in 2 words. Shin Luo had heard it for several days, but he was still not used to it. He was very happy to hear such an affectionate greeting, which he had longed for a long time, come out of her mouth. Shin Luo was a little greedy as he gently kissed her hair. Shin Manting was tickled by his kiss. It was a little comfortable, but also a little uncomfortable. She couldn't describe the feeling and subconsciously avoided it. Shin Luo quickly released her and said softly, I'm a little busy today. I have to go to the laboratory. You and the baby should be good at home. Shin Manting couldn't describe the feeling in her heart. It was a little sour and a little sad. However, his explanation made her feel a little less angry. Shin Manting nodded and put her hands on his shoulders. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him gently on the lips. She said softly, Come back soon. Shin Luo was moved, and his heart was even more shaken. He looked at her deeply and only said one word. Okay. Shin Manting looked into his eyes and felt that there seemed to be endless information in them. She couldn't understand it, but she could tell that he didn't dislike her. He liked her. Realizing this, Shin Manting smiled through her tears. She glanced at his clothes and said, Hubby, I learned how to tie a tie yesterday. Shall I tie a tie for you? Huh. Shin Luo was a little surprised. Who did you learn it from? There's a TV on the phone. I learned from the TV on the phone. As Shin Manting spoke, she walked inside and found a man's tie that had been left unused in the cloakroom for a long time. The light red and dark red checkered tie looked very exquisite and formal. Shin Luo was wearing very simple clothes. He didn't usually need to wear such formal clothes when he went to the laboratory. But when he saw her pick up her tie, he couldn't help but look forward to it. Looking at her expectant smile and her sparkling big eyes, he couldn't help but smile. He stroked her head and said, Then I'll go change my clothes. Shin Luo walked into the cloakroom. As soon as he took off his coat, he saw Shin Manting looking at him with a burning gaze. The fire that had just calmed down was once again easily ignited by her at this moment. His throat tightened, and he closed the door uneasily. When he came out, he had already changed into a formal suit. Chapter 2063. Am I handsome? Shin Luo glanced at his attire and smiled. It's not easy to hear a compliment from you. He. Shin Manting's eyes sparkled. She tightened her tie and said, If you like it, I'll praise you every day. As he spoke, he hopped forward and said, I'll help you with your tie. She was in high spirits. She stood on her tiptoes and put the tie around his neck. Shin Luo had never experienced such a feeling. This feeling of being treasured by her, desired by her, fawned over by her. His heart was filled with warmth as he stared at her fixedly with a pair of eyes. Shin Manting's face was flushed as she concentrated on helping him tie his tie. Like this. Shin Manting muttered to herself as she twirled the tie around. But it didn't seem right no matter how hard she tried. How can it be wrong? That's exactly what the TV said. She scratched her head. But when she looked up, she saw that Shin Luo was looking at her. She didn't know when it started, but that gaze seemed to want to need her deeply. Shin Manting blushed and said, I forgot how to do it. It's okay. Shin Luo looked at her. Take your time. Shin Manting nodded and continued to work. However, his unwavering determination just now had been defeated. Shin Manting felt her face getting hotter and hotter, and her movements became slower and slower. In the end, she couldn't take it anymore. She stomped her feet and said, Aya, don't keep looking at me. I was so nervous that I didn't know what to do. Shin Luo chuckled and looked away. Then I won't look at you. Shin Manting didn't believe him, and quietly lifted her eyes to peek at him. She realized that Shin Luo was really not looking at her anymore. It was as if he did not care at all. This feeling made Shin Manting even more unhappy. He flung his necktie and said, Forget it, I can't handle it. Shin Luo couldn't help but laugh. His heart was surrounded by a thick and sweet feeling. Looking at her little face, which was full of excitement just a moment ago, suddenly looking like a frosted eggplant. He actually felt very satisfied. He couldn't help but hug her. His actions were a little sudden. Shin Manting was shocked and froze. She looked at the frightened expression on his face. Manting. Shin Luo embraced her and called out softly, Manting, Manting. Ah. Shin Manting looked at him timidly and shrank back. She was a little uncertain and asked, Hubby, are you stupid? The smile on Shin Luo's face widened. He pinched her chin with his palm and swallowed her sweetness. Shin Manting only felt that it was a little sudden, but very quickly, her body seemed to have turned into a pool of spring water, indescribably soft. Shin Luo gradually moved deeper and deeper, sweeping her out to be with him. His kiss very deep, very heavy. It was deeper and more dizzying than the last time. Shin Manting's hands unconsciously climbed onto his shoulders, and her whole body seemed to have lost all its strength as she hung onto his body. His body was getting closer and closer. Shin Manting could clearly feel his desire and passion. Between her waist and abdomen, a burning hot unknown object was pressing against her. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling that made her a little uncomfortable. Shin Manting was a little curious. She put her hand down and touched it tentatively. In an instant, Shin Luo's entire body tensed up. Chapter 2064. Shin Luo's eyes were as deep as the sea, dark and bottomless. Shin Manting vaguely felt a sense of danger, and the sense of danger made her look forward to it. Shin Luo's tender hands were still resting on the bed, and he was so stiff that he was close to going crazy. Manting. Shin Luo's voice was low and husky. He pressed against her, and the deep desire in his voice moved her. Honey. Shin Manting suddenly felt a little scared, and she only felt that her palms were getting hotter and hotter. She quickly withdrew her hands, but she heard Shin Luo say in a low voice, Don't move. Shin Manting was shocked, and she didn't dare to move. At the same time, she looked at him in confusion and asked timidly, What? When Shin Luo saw her like this, he immediately felt an inexplicable sense of guilt. His originally tense body became more and more uncomfortable. Shin Luo closed his eyes, put her down and said hoarsely, Nothing. When Shin Manting saw that he was about to leave, she felt a little empty in her heart. She held his hand and said, Honey. Shin Luo was even more angry, and he suppressed the most primitive desire in his heart and looked at her. The lights in the cloakroom were not turned on. Compared to the outside, the light inside was very dim. Shin Manting's eyes seemed to be shining, and she looked at him, pulled his hand and said, You just kissed me so happily. Boom. Her words were like the blazing sun that was shot out of the darkness. In an instant, the light around them suddenly burst, and Shin Luo was even more unable to control himself. He held her hand and pulled her into his arms. Even Shin Luo himself didn't know what he was going to do. It was completely a subconscious action, and when he came to himself, Shin Manting was already in his arms. Shin Manting looked up at Shin Luo. Her pair of big eyes were full of doubt. Looking at Shin Luo, she said softly, Honey, you look so different today. Shin Luo's throat was even more tight, and he asked hoarsely, What's different? What's different? Shin Manting couldn't say it, and facing Shin Luo's burning gaze, her cheeks became even hotter, and she said, It's different. Everything is different. But when he looked down, he saw the protruding bulge. She couldn't help but reach out and poke him. Shin Luo, who was above her, immediately drew in a sharp breath. Don't move. Shin Luo's voice was low and hoarse. He seemed to be enduring it. Don't move. Shin Manting was a little shocked. She quickly withdrew her hand and asked, Dear, are you feeling unwell? Uncomfortable? How could he be comfortable when he was already like this? Shin Luo blushed and pressed her hand down. Shin Manting only felt a burning sensation on her skin. She looked up at him in confusion. If I'm not feeling well, can you help me? Of course. Shin Manting looked at him. I'll go get the medicine from Nanny he. As he spoke, he struggled to get up. But before she could move, Shin Luo pulled her back. You're my medicine. Shin Manting was stunned and looked at him. Then she said with some fear, Hubby, are you going to eat me? Shin Luo's expression deepened. Can I? His voice was low and hoarse, and he asked with desire. Shin Manting looked at him and shrank back. She said, I heard that eating human flesh is not good for the body and it's sour. Chapter 2065. She shrunk back and forth in Shin Luo'an's arms. Shin Luo'an couldn't help laughing when he saw her cute and scared look. What if I have to eat you? Shin Luo'an looked at her, pressed her against the door, and rubbed her gently. I won't feel uncomfortable after eating you. Shin Manting was slightly stunned, and her whole body was hot. She blushed even more, looked away, and said nervously and fearfully, Then if you will feel better after eating me, then you eat me. As she said that, she rolled up her sleeves with trembling hands and stretched out her white and tender hands in front of Shin Luo'an. Bite me. If I'm still alive, remember to send me to the hospital. Although she said that, Shin Manting's eyes were already red. She looked at him with a pleading look. Obviously she was very scared. Shin Luo'an laughed even louder, lifted her up, and lifted her clothes with his palm. Hubby. Shin Manting was a little scared and wanted to hold him down, but she couldn't stop him at all. Shin Luo'an's hand had already reached into her clothes and pinched her lovely white and tender hands. A strange feeling arose from that place. Shin Manting couldn't help but scream, Hubby! Shin Luo, and didn't make a sound, and he lowered his head to take all her words into his mouth. He gently licked and kissed her, and heavily teased her. Oh, Shin Manting couldn't help but breathe heavily, because of his familiar movements. Hearing her voice, Shin Luo'an couldn't help but lower his head and bite her white and erect breasts. He ravaged and sucked, and Shin Manting felt like she was bitten by ants all over, and it was extremely uncomfortable. She couldn't help but make a strange sound, but it was just a sound, and Shin Manting quickly covered her mouth. But her body was still being teased, and the strange and turbulent feeling crushed what little was left of her rationality. She couldn't help but squint her eyes and hold his head with both hands. She clasped her legs around his, and even her toes curled up. She felt uncomfortable all over, but it seemed quite comfortable. Daddy. A childish voice suddenly broke in. The world that had been surging with dark waves was like a mirror that had been shattered by a single punch. Shin Luo'an's movements immediately froze, and Shin Manting breathed a sigh of relief. When Shin Manting realized that she had been put down, she hurriedly tugged at her clothes. His face had already turned red, and his body was burning hot. Shin Manting stumbled out of the room in a hurry. When she saw her son enter the room, she picked up the infant and sat on the bed. His heart was still beating fast, and he could not help but look at the cloakroom. Shin Luo'an walked out from inside. His clothes were disheveled, and the tie around his neck was crooked. Shin Manting couldn't help but take a second look at his tall figure. Shin Luo'an didn't linger and quickly entered the bathroom. She heard the sound of water splashing, and she found it a little strange. Bathing at this time? Aren't you going to work? Just as he was feeling puzzled, Nanny he entered the room. The moment Nanny he saw Shin Manting's swollen lips and messy clothes, as well as the sound of running water in the bathroom, she knew what had happened. She hurried forward and held the little boy's hand. Let's go. Grandma made you something to eat. I'll feed you, Nanny he said. Xiao Yuer pouted unhappily and turned around to hug Shin Manting. I don't want to eat, Mommy. Chapter 2066. She stood up with the baby in her arms and said, I'll go feed him. What did you make? Her cheeks were a little red, and she looked very shy. Nanny he looked at her with an ambiguous expression and said, I made some colorful noodles with vegetable powder. It's very nutritious. Okay. Shin Manting walked out, and Yi Qianqian walked out at the same time. Qianqian. Shin Manting looked at Yi Qianqian and said, You're out. Yi Qianqian blinked. She felt a little uncomfortable being called that. Especially when she thought of what had happened just now. She felt even more embarrassed. Yi Qianqian nodded and forced herself to calm down. What's wrong? Nothing. Shin Manting was a little hesitant, but she quickly said, Are you going out later? No. Yi Qianqian felt that she wanted to say something but stopped. Do you have something to say? Well, I have something to ask you. Let's go out for a walk later. Shin Manting smiled. I have a lot to ask you. Okay. Yi Qianqian agreed. Looking at her expectant look, she felt a little strange. Call me later. Okay. Shin Manting sat on the sofa and fed the baby. Little Moon ate happily while twisting the little toy in his hand. He suddenly looked up and mumbled with his mouth full. Daddy. Shin Luoan was still in the same outfit, but he didn't wear his tie. When he heard the little boys shout, he went forward and rubbed his head. He said to someone, I'm going to work. Wait for me to come back. He was looking at the little boy, but Shin Manting knew that he was talking to her. She nodded and replied softly, Okay. Shin Luoan left quickly. Shin Manting stared at his back, her heart filled with satisfaction. She felt even more embarrassed when she thought of Shin Luoan's intimate actions just now. She also felt strange in her body. It was very strange. Shin Manting didn't know what this feeling was, but it seemed that she liked it. Shin Luoan left quickly. Shin Manting was a little absent-minded as she fed the baby. Nanny, he noticed and said, If you have something to do, go ahead. I'll feed the baby. There's no need for that. Nanny, you can go about your business. I'll do it. Shin Manting insisted. After feeding the baby, she took him to play in the garden. Looking at Little Moon bouncing up and down, Shin Manting felt the happiness of a mother. That's great. Yi Qianqian's voice came from behind. In the blink of an eye, the child has grown up so much. Yi Qianqian looked at the little boy and turned to look at Shin Manting. I really envy you. Why are you envious of me? Shin Manting looked at her in confusion. I'm envious of you. I think you're pretty and sensible. Julia seems to like you very much. Yi Qianqian couldn't help but take another look at her and said, You've indeed changed. Manting, it's better for you to stay like this. Is that so? Shin Manting was a little embarrassed. My husband seems to think so too. Did he say anything to you? Shin Manting shook her head. He didn't say anything, but I could feel that he was thinking the same thing. Chapter 2067. Yi Qianqian thought about it and explained. Actually, it's not that I don't like you. I just like the way you are right now. You look happy every day. You don't remember anything, so you don't feel any pain. It's pretty good. Was it painful for me before? Shin Manting was a little puzzled. I feel like I'm the one who's in pain now that I don't know anything. Hubby always calls me Manting, 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 but I don't feel happy at all. I feel so sad. After all, she was a 12-year-old girl and didn't know how to hide her emotions at all. Yi Qianqian looked at her pouting face and turned her head away. She seemed to be sighing with emotion as she said meaningfully, He loves you. I know. Shin Manting replied with a smile on her face. However, within a few seconds, her smile disappeared and she said, But he won't play with me. Yi Qianqian was speechless. Looking at Shin Manting's angry face, she didn't seem to be joking. It was at that moment that Yi Qianqian once again realized that this was a 12-year-old girl. Yi Qianqian thought for a moment and explained, Perhaps Big Brother is busy. She glanced at Shin Manting's expression and deliberated over her choice of words before saying, Moreover, he's more mature and steady. Normally, I don't think he'll play much. The more Yi Qianqian thought about it, the more convinced she became. She finally made up her mind and nodded her head. He's always been so serious. Don't mind him too much. But why can Julia play with you? Shin Manting was puzzled. Yi Qianqian was surprised. Ha! You had so much fun this morning. Shin Manting looked at him enviously and said, My husband never plays with me. I want to play too. Yi Qianqian was speechless. She thought Shin Manting was talking about the game of Eagle Catches Chicks, or hide and seek. Hearing this, he coughed lightly and said, Well, what we did this morning can't be considered as playing. Huh. Shin Manting was a little confused. But you're smiling so happily. Aren't you playing? Yi Qianqian felt a little embarrassed and replied, Well, not really. Besides, I'm not that happy either. Yes. Shin Manting was very certain. You're so happy. Yi Qianqian replied, Well, be happy then. Humph. You're still trying to deceive me. Shin Manting looked as if she had already seen through him. Yi Qianqian felt even more embarrassed. When she saw Yi Qianqian's expression, She explained in all seriousness. I didn't. We weren't actually playing. To be exact, we were flirting. Shin Manting's eyes widened when she heard that word. Flirt. She looked as if Yi Qianqian had said something unbelievable. Yi Qianqian suddenly felt guilty for lying to a little girl. When she saw the expression on Yi Qianqian's face, she turned her head away and said, Yeah, we're husband and wife. It's normal for us to flirt and play around. Then why doesn't my husband flirt with me? Yi Qianqian replied, I can't answer your question. Why? Shin Manting was puzzled. Yi Qianqian was silent for a moment before she said, How about this? When Big Brother comes home at night, you can ask him. You can say, Honey, why aren't you flirting with me? Look at the people next door, they're all flirting. Chapter 2068. Yi Qianqian said, That's not the point. The point is that you have to ask him. You shouldn't be asking me this kind of question. Oh, okay. Shin Manting nodded quickly. I understand. I'll ask him tonight why he didn't flirt with me. Yi Qianqian finally raised her head in relief and said, Very good, but don't tell him that I taught you. It'll be troublesome if you say that I'm a bad influence on a child. Shin Manting looked at her with a smile and said, You're the child. I'm taller than you. You're more like a child than me. Yi Qianqian was a little confused. She sighed softly and said, I shouldn't have told you so much. She seemed to have been a bad influence on her. Shin Manting's temperament, the way she spoke, and the expression in her eyes didn't seem like that of a normal adult. Although she was not mentally retarded, Yi Qianqian could no longer treat her as a peer. Shin Manting looked at her and asked, How long have you been married to Julia? 2 years. Yi Qianqian glanced at Little Moon, who was playing with the grass on the ground. I got married to old Shin the year Big Brother brought him back. Then, when did my husband and I get married? Shin Manting looked at her and said, I think it's been a long time, but it doesn't seem that long. Shin Manting suddenly felt a little childish when she said that. She coughed and said with a straight face, That's right. I'm just curious. You're married, and you have a ring on your finger. Shin Manting glanced at Yi Qianqian's hand. On the ring finger of her left hand, there was a very shiny and beautiful diamond ring. After a moment, she looked at her somewhat thin hand. Her skin was a little yellow, and it didn't look as good as Yi Qianqian's hand at all. And I don't have a ring on my finger. Yi Qianqian subconsciously hid her hand when she heard that. Her eyes were a little evasive. She looked into the distance and suddenly felt a little guilty. Why didn't I think of that? Why didn't I have a ring? Because Shin Manting and Shin Luo were not married at all. Shin Manting was not willing to wear Shin Luo's ring at all. However, even though she knew that, how could she bring it up to Shin Manting? It was difficult to speak at all. He glanced at Shin Manting, coughed softly and said, Maybe it's because you've slept for too long. Look at your hand. It's so skinny. How can you wear a ring? Yes. Shin Manting felt inexplicably happy when she heard his answer. That's what I thought too. Actually, I saw a ring in the shape of a heart with many diamonds. It was placed under the blanket, but it was too big for me, so I put it back. Shin Manting spoke with a hint of boastfulness in her voice. It's very beautiful. As Yi Qianqian watched, she found it amusing and sad at the same time. She nodded her head and reached out to hold Yi Qianqian's hand. In a soft voice she said, It's good that you like him. Big Brother actually likes you very much. He loves you very much. As long as you believe in him with all your heart, he won't let you down. Shin Manting felt a little puzzled and didn't quite understand what she meant. She nodded and said, Yes, I know he loves me very much. I can feel it. No one has ever treated me like this before. I love him very much too. Yes, I know he loves me very much. I can feel it. No one has ever treated me like this before. Chapter 2069. Huh? Yi Qianqian's eyes widened, and she was a little confused. What did you just say? Shin Manting thought that she hadn't made herself clear, so she repeated, Can you teach me how to seduce men? Yi Qianqian wanted to laugh, but when she saw Shin Manting's serious expression, she couldn't laugh. She coughed lightly. Actually, I don't know how to do that. As long as a man likes you, you don't have to seduce him. He will come over himself. If he doesn't like you, no matter how you seduce him, it's useless. These words were the truth of the world. When Yi Qianqian said this, she saw that Shen Manting had a look of understanding on her face. Then do I still have to seduce my husband? Shen Manting looked a little defeated. I think my husband likes me, but sometimes I feel that he doesn't like me that much. Yesterday, I used my phone to check it out and tried to imitate what's written on it, but I realized that it didn't work. What things? Prepare the bathwater for my husband, shave, tie his tie, and give him a good morning kiss. Wow. Yi Qianqian was a little surprised. You did all that? A little. Tisk tisk. Yi Qianqian laughed even more. She didn't know how she felt, but she said, I've never done those things that you mentioned. Moreover, Shen Jilia had always been the one who prepared the bathwater for her. Well, in all fairness, Shen Jilia was really good to her. Although he had been a little demanding in some aspects recently, at least he was wholeheartedly devoted to her. Shen Manting felt a little embarrassed, and her cheeks turned slightly red. She said, Oh, it's my first time being someone else's wife. I don't know what to do. As she said this, she pouted and said, Qianqian, teach me what I should do. Otherwise, I don't know what to do to be a wife. It's very simple. You just have to take care of the child. Yi Qianqian shrugged. The child is still young. You have to take care of the child and let him worry less. That's a good wife. Oh, Shen Manting nodded and couldn't help but ask curiously. Since you don't have children, what do you usually do when you have nothing to do? Yi Qianqian replied. Give birth. Oh. Shen Manting looked at her belly and asked. Are you going to have a baby? Yi Qianqian rubbed her belly and smiled bitterly. I'll give birth once I'm pregnant. The key was that she couldn't get pregnant. In the past 2 years, they had not taken any safety measures. She just couldn't get pregnant. This year, she was already 28 years old. If she delayed any longer, she might become an elderly pregnant woman. Moreover, if Grandma and Uncle Blind were right this year, it was very likely that she could get pregnant. She looked at Little Moon, who was having a great time playing by himself. She felt a twinge of jealousy in her heart and said longingly, That's why I'm so envious of you. You don't know anything when you wake up. You've forgotten all the unhappy things. You even have a cute baby and a man who loves you. Shen Manting sensed that she seemed to be a little sad, so she cautiously said, You have it too. You have to continue living happily. When Yi Qianqian saw the look on her face, a bright smile appeared on her face, and she nodded her head. Yeah. Shen Jilia came home very early that day, and he seemed to be in a good mood. Chapter 2070. Little Moon looked at him and gave him a peck on the cheek. Shen Jilia smiled and asked, Where's your aunt? The little guy's eyes were big, black, and bright. He pointed to the room and said, Sun Senior. Auntie, lift your tongue. Shen Jilia pinched his cheek. Tell me, Auntie. Sunsun. Little Moon grinned and wiggled his little body excitedly. Uncle. Little rascal. Shen Jilia said as he placed him on the sofa. He looked up and saw Shen Manting walking out of the kitchen with a plate of fruit in her hand. Sister-in-law, Qianqian and I are going back to Yintown for a while. Well, Yintown is Qianqian's hometown, right? She gave him a watermelon. Qianqian told me about it. Go ahead. I'll go in first then. Shen Jilia took a bite of the watermelon, then stood up and pushed the door open. Honey, I'm back. Yi Qianqian was sleeping. When she heard Shen Jilia's voice, she covered her head with the blanket and shouted, Don't be noisy. Shen Jilia took off his shoes and leaned over. He pulled down the blanket and teased, You're sleeping so early? Were you tired last night? You still have the nerve to say that? Yi Qianqian lifted the blanket and said angrily, I haven't been feeling well for the past few days, and you deliberately messed with me. How did I do that? Shen Jilia looked aggrieved. He leaned over and whispered, Aren't I working hard for our future happiness? Scram. Shen Jilia laughed out loud and tugged at her. Let's go. If we rush back to Yintown now, we can still take Dad out for dinner. I've already told him. What time is it? It's 4 o'clock. The plane leaves at 5:30. Yi Qianqian immediately stood up and said, Wait for me. By the time Yi Qianqian finished washing up, more than 10 minutes had passed. Shen Jilya had it simple. He pulled his suitcase up and went to the door to wait for her. On his way out, Shen Jilya noticed that Shen Manting seemed to be glancing at him a few times. She couldn't help but ask, Sister-in-law, do you need something from me? Shen Manting shook her head and said, No. Oh. Shen Jilya looked away, but after a while, he felt that she was looking at him again. Shen Manting looked up and immediately averted her eyes. Shen Jilya found it a little strange, but soon, Yi Qianqian came out. As the couple walked out of the house, Shen Jilya whispered, Why do I feel that Sister Manting is acting a little strange today? Yi Qianqian was shocked, but she quickly pretended to be calm and asked, How so? That's right. I think she's peeking at me. Shen Jilya felt goosebumps all over his body. She's only 12 years old at the moment. Don't tell me she fell in love with me because I'm handsome? Go away. Yi Qianqian shot him a look of disdain. How can you be so shameless? I think she might want to ask you something. What is it? Ahem. She kept pestering me with questions for the whole day, so I just gave her a CD. Shen Jilya had a bad feeling about this. What disc? It's the one you brought back last time. Yi Qianqian was a little embarrassed and ran forward. Shen Jilya was dumbfounded. He quickly chased after her and shouted, Are you crazy? Big brother is going to kill me. Chapter 2071. Shen Jilya was actually convinced by her fallacious reasoning, but he still felt strange in his heart, so he followed her and said, Wait for me. Shen Manting took care of the child while he ate and bathed. She finally managed to coax him to sleep before she went to wash up. When she came out, it was already past 8 o'clock, but Shen Luoan still hadn't returned. Shen Manting was a little bored, so she took out the thing that Yi Qianqian had given her in the afternoon. It was a small round box with a CD inside. The CD was two-sided and had no pictures. She followed the method that Yi Qianqian had taught her in the afternoon. She first locked the door, then turned on the computer in the room, and then inserted the CD into it. Her fingers touched the touch panel a few times, and after clicking the mouse an image appeared. A drunken man, wearing a suit, stumbled back home. Soon, a woman who looked very conservatively opened the door and carried him in. She spoke in a strange language that Shen Manting couldn't understand at all. After watching for a while, Shen Manting finally understood. The husband was probably drunk. When he returned home, the wife brought a basin of water, wrung out a towel, and wiped the husband's face and hands. She also took off the husband's suit, and then took off his shoes. Shen Manting secretly noted it down and thought to herself, The next time my husband comes home drunk, I'll take care of him like this. But in the TV, the husband was sleeping on the sofa, so when the time came, she would directly carry her husband to the big bed. But as she continued to watch, something didn't seem right. The wife began to cry, and as she cried, the husband seemed to become impatient and kicked his wife. Shen Manting saw it, and felt a little angry. That's so annoying. How dare he hit his wife? But then she saw the wife stand up and walk away. Well done. Shen Manting was angry, and then she applauded her wife. But then, the husband seemed to have a look of regret on his face. He stood up and staggered back to the room with his wife. Back in the room, the wife sat on the bed and cried bitterly. When she saw her husband come in, she stopped crying and didn't dare to move. The husband went forward, pinched his wife's chin and kissed her. Shen Manting's eyes widened, and she couldn't believe what she saw. Weren't they just arguing? What was even more unbelievable was that the woman did not resist and hugged the man. After kissing for a few minutes, they began to undress. Shen Manting was actually a little excited. She hugged her legs and sat on the bed with great interest. Soon, the husband's shirt was taken off, and the wife was only left with a white bra. Her husband pushed the bra up and bit her. Shen Manting subconsciously covered her small chest. She was suddenly reminded of what Shen Luo and had done to her in the morning. Then he heard an ambiguous voice coming from the woman's mouth. Shin Manting covered her mouth, and her cheeks turned red. It was the same feeling she had in the morning. She felt a little uncomfortable, and as she watched, she felt more and more uncomfortable. As the scene on the television became more and more intense, the wife placed her palm on the place where her husband peed. It was so big. It was completely different from Little Moon's. Shin Manting suddenly realized that the spot she had poked several times in the morning wasn't that the spot. Heavens! Chapter 2072. Then his wife ate the thing in one bite. Shin Manting was a little shocked and watched with her eyes wide open. However, she didn't expect that the man not only didn't seem to be in pain, but also enjoyed it. The man's voice was extremely embarrassing. Shin Manting couldn't help but rub her legs. When she was about to continue watching, she suddenly heard the sound of the door opening. Perhaps the door couldn't be opened, so someone knocked on it from outside. Shin Manting quickly closed the computer, got out of bed, and opened the door. Shin Luoan looked a little tired. When he saw her, he smiled slightly. He reached out to touch her head and said, "Why did you lock the door all of a sudden?" Shin Manting felt even more uncomfortable. She looked away guiltily and said, "Why did you come back so late? It's only 9 o'clock. It's not late." Shin Luoan walked in and closed the door. "I'll come back early tomorrow." However, when the light in the room was turned on, he could clearly see her face. He reached out to touch it, and it was indeed a little hot. Shin Luoan frowned and had a bad feeling. "What's wrong with you? Why is your face so red?" Shin Manting lowered her head and quickly took his hand away. She mumbled, "Well, I'll go run the bathwater for you." After that, she quickly turned around and went to the bathroom. Shin Manting turned on the faucet and heard the sound of running water. She finally breathed a sigh of relief. When she thought of the image on the computer, she felt even more ashamed. It was too perverted. How could Yi Qianqian show her such a thing? "Qianqian, I don't think the 10 little things on the internet are very useful. Do you have any way to make my husband like me more?" "Well, there is. But it's not very suitable for you." "What way?" "I can do it. It's not convenient for me to say. But if you are interested, I can give you a CD. You can watch it whenever you want, but you must watch it at night. Don't watch it during the day. When you watch it, lock the door and wait for your husband to come back. He will like you." "Really? Really, you can try it." "Well, thank you so much, Qianqian." She thought it would be similar to the 10 little things, but she didn't expect it to be. Shin Manting's mind was buzzing, but suddenly she remembered. It seems the computer is still on the bed. She immediately stood up and jogged out of the room. The sound of water was getting softer and softer, but at the same time, another sound was getting louder and louder. Shin Manting's body tensed up, and she immediately heard the man's panting. "Don't look." Shin Manting hurried forward, covered the laptop, and hid it behind her. His face was already as red as an apple. I didn't know it was such a thing." Shin Manting stammered. "Someone gave it to me." "Who gave it to you?" Shin Luoan walked over and stood in front of her. He looked at her with a burning gaze. Shin Manting felt an itch in her heart. She looked at him and said, "Qianqian gave it to me." "Why did she give you this?" She said. Shin Manting was extremely embarrassed. "I asked her how I could make you like me more. She told me to lock the door and watch this, so that you would like me more. So I watched it." Shin Manting said, "You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."